A knight's body slams against the stone gatehouse, his armor crumpling like wet parchment. Blood sprays across the muddy trench, painting the gray masonry in a jagged crimson streak. The wall does not even shudder under the futile impact. 1,000 men die in the mud while the castle remains untouched. Eirik Vollen watches the slaughter from the dirt, his eyes burning with a phantom heat. The world is a geometry of death, and today, the math was wrong from the start. Eirik pressed his palms into the freezing slush, his breath rattling in his chest. The air smelled of copper, sulfur, and the sour rot of a failed campaign. Nearby, the heavy iron gate of the fortress loomed, slick with rain and indifferent to the carnage below. He blinked, and the world shifted into a terrifying, monochromatic map of stress. Bright, pulsing lines of orange and red crawled across the stone, marking every point of structural fatigue. The gatehouse was not an impenetrable wall. It was a bridge of fragile, interlocking tension. His vision blurred as the strain of the architect's eye hammered against his skull like a blunt chisel. A sharp, metallic taste flooded his mouth as a thin ribbon of blood leaked from his left tear duct. Jarl Hauk Valdres stood over him, his boots caked in the gore of the vanguard. The commander's plate armor was dented, his cloak heavy with the weight of the downpour. Hauk looked at the dead knight, then down at the shivering squire in the mud. The Jarl's hand rested on the hilt of his broadsword, his expression a mask of grim frustration. Eirik pointed a shaking finger at the keystone hidden beneath the iron portcullis. The red glow of the eye pulsed violently in his mind, highlighting the exact frequency needed to shatter the mortar. Hauk gripped Eirik by the throat, hauling him upward until his boots dangled above the mire. The Jarl's eyes were cold, reflecting the flickering torches of the distant, silent walls. He demanded to know why a common squire dared to speak of structural collapse while his brothers bled out in the dirt. Eirik gasped, his vision swimming as the thermal map of the gatehouse refused to fade. He claimed the wall would fall if a single heavy impact hit the keystone at a precise, calculated angle. Hauk laughed, a harsh sound that barely carried over the moans of the dying. The Jarl dropped him back into the mud with a wet thud. He unsheathed his blade, the steel ringing with a sharp, resonant chime. Hauk gave him until the first light of dawn to prove his words or face the executioner's axe. The commander turned away, his silhouette disappearing into the swirling mist of the camp. Eirik remained on his knees, his hands trembling as he traced lines in the wet earth. The eye throbbed, showing him the weakness of the world, even as his own strength flickered toward darkness. He crawled toward a pile of discarded siege debris near the tree line. Splintered oak beams and rusted iron chains lay scattered like the bones of some forgotten beast. His fingers brushed against a jagged piece of steel, his mind already calculating the weight and leverage required for a counterweight. The knights relied on mana-infused armor to survive, but stone did not possess a soul to harden. Stone followed the laws of physics, and physics was the only language the fortress understood. Eirik dragged a heavy beam toward a muddy depression, his muscles screaming in protest. He stacked the wood with methodical precision, ignoring the jeers of the passing soldiers. They mocked the squire who played with sticks while the kingdom's finest were slaughtered by sorcery. He did not look up, his focus locked entirely on the structural load of his prototype. The eye flickered, showing him the center of gravity shifting as he wedged a stone beneath the frame. A shadow fell over his work, blocking the pale moonlight. It was a young soldier, his face pale and his hands shaking as he clutched a spear. The boy asked if Eirik truly believed he could break the unbreakable gate. Eirik did not answer, his eyes fixed on the tension cable he was knotting with frayed rope. He realized the boy was terrified, a mirror of his own internal coldness. He tightened the final knot, the rope biting into his blistered palms. The structure groaned, the wood protesting the unnatural strain he had forced upon it. It was not a weapon of magic, but a machine of pure, cold logic. He stepped back, his vision tunneling into a sharp, painful point of clarity. The gatehouse in the distance shimmered, the red stress fractures growing brighter as the night deepened. He knew the cost of his sight, the coming migraine that would leave him blind for hours. He looked at the horizon, where the sky began to bleed a faint, bruised purple. Dawn was coming, and with it, the edge of Hauk's blade. Eirik stood alone in the dark, a broken man building a mountain out of scrap to tear down a kingdom. Eirik dragged a rusted iron winch across the churned mud. His hands were raw, the skin split and weeping into the grime. He ignored the stinging pain in his palms. The camp was a graveyard of broken dreams and discarded metal. He scavenged a thick, splintered oak beam from the wreckage of a supply wagon. His architect's eye flickered, painting the wood in cool, analytical blues. He visualized the weight distribution of a counterweight system. The knights around him sharpened their swords with rhythmic, metallic scrapes. They did not understand the geometry of force. They relied on mana-infused steel to carry their weight. Eirik wedged a jagged gear into a frame of rotted timber. He calculated the leverage needed to bypass the fortress's magically reinforced mortar. The wood groaned under the pressure of the heavy rope. He tightened the tension cable until the fibers hummed with potential energy. A shadow stretched long across the mud as a group of riders approached. The knights parted, their armor clanking in a display of practiced reverence. Lady Sigrun Grit sat atop a white stallion, her cloak embroidered with silver thread. She looked at Eirik's crude wooden frame with a thin, mocking smile. The squire appeared to be playing with discarded trash, she remarked. She stepped down from her horse, her boots clean and pristine against the filth. Her eyes scanned the machine, dismissing the physics as pathetic superstition. She reached out a gloved hand, tracing the taut rope with a sharp fingernail. The air shimmered with the faint violet haze of her mana infusion. She told Eirik that true power was forged in the soul, not in sticks. She pressed her thumb against the main tension cable. A silent surge of energy hummed through the rope. Eirik watched the fibers begin to fray, the structural integrity failing under her touch. He shouted for her to stop, his voice cracking with sudden dread. Sigrun ignored him, her gaze fixed on the distant, silent walls of the fortress. She claimed that his machine was an insult to the noble knightly order. She turned back to her horse, her movements fluid and dismissive. The tension cables snapped with the sound of a thunderclap. The heavy oak beam swung wildly, released from the force of the tension. It slammed into the side of the wooden frame, shattering the supports. Shrapnel flew through the air like deadly serrated teeth. A scream pierced the camp, raw and sudden. Jarl Hauk Valdris's most loyal sergeant collapsed, his leg pinned beneath the falling timber. Blood pooled in the mud, dark and thick against the gray stone. The sergeant clutched his crushed limb, his face turning an ashen white. Eirik scrambled toward the wreckage, his mind racing to calculate the damage. The machine lay in ruins, a useless pile of splinters and snapped chains. Hawk pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He looked at the broken soldier, then at the shattered remains of the prototype. Sigrun watched from her saddle, her expression one of bored disappointment. She remarked that the squire's toys were as fragile as his ambition. Hauk turned his gaze toward Eirik, his eyes burning with a dark, heavy weight. The Jarl's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. He demanded to know how Eirik could justify such a catastrophic failure. Eirik knelt in the mud, his eyes scanning the snapped rope. He saw the faint, lingering heat of mana that had weakened the fibers. The truth was a heavy stone in his throat. If he accused Lady Sigrun, he would be executed for treason by noon. He remained silent, his breath hitching in the cold, damp air. Hawk stepped closer, the mud sucking at his heavy, armored boots. He reminded Eirik of the sunrise deadline he had been granted. The Jarl turned away, leaving the squire alone in the wreckage. The soldiers dispersed, their laughter echoing through the dying light of the camp. Eirik looked at his blistered, shaking hands. The architect's eye throbbed with a dull, persistent ache in his temples. He realized he had lost the only tool that could bridge the distance to the walls. He crawled to the sergeant's side, his fingers trembling as he examined the wound. The bone was shattered, the structural failure complete. He pulled a length of twine from his belt, his eyes fixed on the task. He began to bind the wound, his movements precise despite the encroaching darkness. The camp grew quiet, the only sound the distant, mocking wind. He knew he had to rebuild, but his resources were gone. He looked toward the tree line, where the shadows of the forest loomed. There was iron in the earth, and he possessed the knowledge to extract it. He stood up, his legs stiff and aching from the long hours of labor. He would not rely on the favor of the nobility. He would build a machine that neither magic nor sabotage could break. The eye pulsed with a sharp, white light, showing him the path forward. He walked into the darkness, leaving the ruins of his first failure behind. The moon rose, casting long, jagged shadows over the field of the dead. Every step was a calculation of survival. The kingdom of Oakhaven was a machine, and he was the only one who saw its gears. He reached the edge of the camp where the discarded scrap lay in heaps. He began to sort the metal, his fingers identifying each piece by its weight. He needed a new alloy, something that could withstand the strain of his design. The knights were busy with their evening prayers, their shields lined up in rows. They would not notice a squire dragging iron into the deep woods. He worked through the night, his body burning with the effort of the labor. The migraine began to claw at the back of his eyes. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain cloud his vision. He needed to build a frame that could survive the pressure of the earth itself. He found a heavy iron chain, its links thick and pitted with rust. He would use it to reinforce the tension, turning the machine into a trap. The logic of the siege was simple. Once the variables were stripped away, he was not fighting for the glory of a king. He was fighting for the survival of the physics he understood. The first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. He had finished the base, a tripod of iron and timber buried deep in the soil. It was ugly, heavy, and entirely immune to the touch of mana. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his vision blurring at the edges. He turned back toward the camp, his steps slow and measured. He had to face Hauk before the sun fully cleared the trees. He walked past the sentries, who stared at him with hollow, tired eyes. The camp was waking, the smell of burnt porridge thick in the air. He found Hauk sitting by the dying embers of a fire. The Jarl was cleaning his blade, the steel reflecting the pale morning light. Eirik stopped a few paces away, his head bowed in a show of respect. He told Hauk that the machine was ready for a second test. Hauk looked up, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his helmet. He asked if the Squire was prepared to lose his head. Eirik did not flinch, his gaze fixed on the Jarl's heavy, steel-clad chest. He promised that this time the wall would be the one to break. Hauk stood, his armor clanking with the sound of a collapsing tower. He gestured for the Squire to lead the way back into the woods. They walked in silence, the soldiers following at a distance. Sigrun appeared on the path, her horse's hooves soft on the pine needles. She looked at Eirik with a mixture of curiosity and cold disdain. She followed them to the clearing, her hand resting on her dagger. Eirik stopped before the tripod, his masterpiece of scrap and iron. He began to load the projectile, a jagged boulder he had shaped with a chisel. The tension cable hummed as he cranked the iron winch. The machine did not groan, it held with the rigidity of a mountain. He looked at Sigrun, his eyes cold and devoid of fear. He dared her to touch the cable this time. She laughed, but she kept her hands folded firmly against her chest. Hauk stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the target in the distance. The fortress gate stood silent, a monolith of stone and ancient magic. Eirik adjusted the angle, his eye mapping the stress points of the stone arch. He took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and wet, freezing earth. He pulled the release lever with a sharp, decisive jerk. The machine fired, the sound a low, resonant boom that vibrated in the chest. The boulder tore through the air, a blur of gray stone against the sky. It hit the keystone of the gatehouse with a sickening, wet crunch. The stone did not resist. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The entire archway buckled, the weight of the wall above shifting and falling. A cloud of dust and debris erupted, swallowing the gate in a gray shroud. Silence descended on the clearing, heavy and absolute. Hauk stared at the ruin, his jaw tight beneath his beard. Sigrun's face went pale, her composure finally breaking into a mask of shock. Eirik collapsed to his knees, his vision fading into a wall of black. The migraine hit him like a physical blow to the back of his skull. He could hear the distant rumble of the falling gate. He could hear the shouts of the soldiers, a roar of disbelief. He did not care for their praise or their wonder. He had proven the logic of the world. He had broken the unbreakable with a piece of scrap and a simple law. The darkness claimed him, and he fell face first into the cold, soft mud. The camp air tasted of damp pine and the metallic tang of cooling iron. Eirik sat amidst the discarded scrap, his hands trembling from the strain of his own nerves. He stared at the twisted remains of the tension cable. It had been sliced with surgical precision, the fibers frayed in a way no accident could explain. Lady Sigrun Grit stood near the edge of the clearing, her silver-trimmed cloak a stark contrast to the mud. She watched him with a thin, sharp smile that never reached her eyes. Nearby, 2 of her personal attendants scribbled notes onto parchment held against their leather-clad thighs. Eirik looked down at his own designs, the charcoal sketches now smeared by the damp earth. He realized she was not here to witness a failure. She was here to catalog his methods for the royal armory. He wiped his hands on his tunic, his palms slick with a mixture of grease and sweat. The weight of the project sat heavy in his chest, a burden of physics he could not share. He stood up, his joints popping in the silence of the woods. He walked toward the common squires gathered near the supply tents. They stood in the cold, their faces gaunt and their shoulders slumped under the weight of their duty. He pointed to a stack of heavy timber logs piled near the tree line. He commanded them to move the wood in a specific interlocking pattern. The boys hesitated, looking toward the knights who lounged by the fire. Eirik grabbed the end of a thick beam and shoved it into place with a grunt of exertion. His muscles screamed in protest, but the alignment was perfect. He showed them how to use a lever, a simple branch wedged against a stone. The heaviest log lifted with a fraction of the usual effort. The squires stared, their eyes widening as they saw the wood hover in the air. Eirik explained that strength was not found in the arm, but in the fulcrum. He did not mention the architect's eye or the heat maps that guided his every move. He kept his voice low, a rhythmic cadence that mirrored the heartbeat of his machine. Across the camp, Sigrun's attendants continued to sketch, their quills scratching against the parchment. They recorded the angle of the beams and the placement of the iron joints. Eirik watched them from the corner of his vision, his jaw tightening. He saw them note the way he tied the ropes, a sailor's knot designed for maximum tension. He realized then that his intellectual property was being stripped away, one observation at a time. He needed to change the design without them noticing the shift. He called for a hammer and a set of rusted iron nails. He began to build a secondary frame, a decoy meant to draw their focus. He intentionally left the primary load-bearing joints exposed to their prying eyes. He masked the true stress distribution points with layers of mud and scrap metal. The sun climbed higher, casting long, harsh shadows across the clearing. His migraine began to thrum behind his temples, a dull, rhythmic pulse. He ignored the pain, focusing instead on the geometry of the timber. Jarl Hauk approached, his heavy boots crushing the dry leaves into dust. The Jarl stopped beside the decoy frame, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He asked if the machine would be ready for the next march. Eirik bowed his head, keeping his eyes fixed on the dirt. He promised that the structure would hold, no matter the resistance it faced. Sigrun stepped forward, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. She mocked the simplicity of his construction, calling it a child's toy for a soldier's war. She reached out to touch the exposed iron, her fingers lingering on the joint he had deliberately weakened. Eirik held his breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. She pulled her hand away, seemingly satisfied that the design was flawed. She turned and signaled her attendants to follow her back toward the main camp. They tucked their sketches into leather satchels, the blueprints of his future now in their possession. Eirik waited until the last of her retinue vanished behind the trees. He exhaled, the air escaping his lungs in a sharp, jagged hiss. He turned to the squires and began to dismantle the decoy frame. He discarded the exposed joints and reached into his hidden stash of reinforced steel. He began to weld the true mechanism, his hands moving with the precision of a master builder. The squires watched him, their initial hesitation replaced by a budding curiosity. He taught them how to measure the tension of the cable by the sound of its vibration. He showed them how to read the grain of the wood for hidden fractures. They were no longer just laborers, they were becoming the gears of his engine. The shadows lengthened, turning the clearing into a sanctuary of gray and brown. He felt the familiar throb of the eye, the world beginning to shimmer with thermal data. He saw the heat of the wood fibers, the stress points glowing like dying embers in the dark. He adjusted the final bolt, his vision blurring as the migraine intensified. The machine stood complete, an ugly, jagged silhouette against the rising moon. It looked like a pile of scrap to any untrained eye. To him, it was a lethal, calculated equation waiting to be solved. He sat down in the mud, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion. The squires stood guard, their hands resting on the handles of their makeshift tools. They looked toward the horizon, where the lights of the capital flickered like distant stars. Eirik closed his eyes, the image of the palace walls burned into his mind. He knew the king's architects would soon be building their own versions of his device. He knew they would fail, for they lacked the understanding of the underlying physics. He rested his head against the cold iron of the tripod. He was the architect of his own destruction, and he was ready to face the consequences. The night air grew colder, frost gathering on the tips of the pines. He listened to the distant sounds of the army, the low murmur of soldiers and the clatter of steel. He was a squire, a nobody, a relic of a failed kingdom. But as he stared at the dark frame of the trebuchet, he knew the world was about to break. He fell into a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with the sound of snapping timber and falling stone. The morning mist clung to the damp timber of the trebuchet. Eirik stood before the frame, his eyes tracing the glowing thermal lines of the main arm. He adjusted the release pin by a fraction of a millimeter. The metal felt ice cold against his trembling fingertips. A group of veteran soldiers gathered at the edge of the clearing. They leaned on their spears and watched him with weary, skeptical faces. Jarl Hauk paced behind the machine, his hand resting on the hilt of his heavy broadsword. He demanded to know if the contraption was ready for the test. Eirik ignored the question and focused on the tension cable. He calculated the drag coefficient of the heavy stone projectile resting in the sling. The architect's eye throbbed behind his brow, casting a searing red grid over the wooden structure. He saw the potential for a catastrophic snap in the secondary support beam. He grabbed a heavy mallet from the mud. He drove a reinforcing iron spike into the base, binding the wood to the earth. The movement sent a sharp, stabbing pain through his skull. He gritted his teeth as a thin line of blood trickled from his left tear duct. He wiped the red smear away with his sleeve before anyone could notice. He signaled the squires to pull the winch. The thick ropes groaned under the immense pressure. The wood of the trebuchet creaked, a high-pitched protest against the gathering force. Eirik watched the heat maps shift from blue to a dangerous, pulsating orange. The structural stress was reaching a critical threshold. He estimated the trajectory, accounting for the slight breeze shifting the forest canopy above. He adjusted the angle of the arm one final time. He pulled the release lever with a sharp, downward jerk. The machine lurched violently, the wooden frame slamming against the hardened ground. The projectile soared into the air, a dark blur against the pale morning sky. It hit the reinforced target wall with the force of a falling mountain. The target was a series of wooden stakes, infused with the kinetic mana of 3 knights. It was designed to repel any standard siege weapon. The impact sound was not a thud but a sickening crack of splintering timber and shattering stone. The mana shield shimmered, then collapsed in a shower of golden sparks. The entire wall disintegrated into a pile of useless rubble. The soldiers stood frozen, their mouths agape as they stared at the destruction. Eirik collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming in a sea of black spots. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but the grid of heat maps remained burned into his sight. His nose began to bleed, the dark liquid pooling on the packed dirt. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of a neurological migraine settling into his brain. Jarl Haukvaldr stepped over the debris, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and calculation. He looked at the shattered wall, then back at the kneeling Squire. The Jarl reached out to grab Eirik by the shoulder. He asked if the boy could replicate the feat on a larger scale. Eirik tried to answer, but his tongue felt like a leaden weight in his mouth. He leaned forward, his forehead touching the cold, muddy earth. He saw the world through a fractured lens of red light. Every object in the clearing seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his failing vision. Lady Sigrun Greet emerged from the tree line, her guards trailing behind her in silence. She observed the ruin of the target wall with a cold, unreadable expression. She walked toward the trebuchet, her boots clicking against the stones. She ignored the Jarl and stared directly down at the broken boy in the mud. She stated that such power was an affront to the natural order of the kingdom. She claimed the machine was fueled by dark, forbidden arts. Eirik forced his eyes open, trying to focus on her embroidered silk cloak. He saw the heat radiating from her body, a faint, flickering aura of controlled mana. He realized she was not just mocking him, she was measuring his threat level. He needed to hide the true source of his calculation. He whispered that it was merely a matter of physics, not magic. His voice sounded thin and distant, like wind whistling through a hollow pipe. Sigrun laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that grated against his nerves. She ordered her men to secure the machine for royal inspection. The soldiers hesitated, looking toward the Jarl for a command. Hauk stood between them and the machine, his hand tightening on his sword. The Jarl warned her that the machine was under his jurisdiction. He reminded her that the king demanded results, not petty political squabbles. Sigrun narrowed her eyes, her gaze lingering on the blood staining Eirik's face. She turned on her heel and retreated toward the camp. The squires rushed to Eirik's side, their faces pale with genuine concern. They lifted him up, his legs dragging through the mud like dead weight. He looked back at the trebuchet one last time. It stood as a jagged, ugly monument to his own physical decay. He knew that if he used the eye again, he might lose his sight entirely. He allowed his head to loll against a squire's shoulder as the world faded into gray. The camp was a blur of movement and murmuring voices. He heard the soldiers discussing the impossible distance of the shot. He felt the cool air of the tent as they laid him on a cot. He drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, his dreams filled with grinding gears and snapping wood. The price of his knowledge was written in the blood drying on his skin. He was a weapon, and he was rapidly being dismantled by his own design. The army of Oakhaven crawled toward the capital like a wounded beast. Eirik Vollen sat in the back of a supply wagon, his eyes bandaged against the harsh sunlight. He listened to the rhythmic thud of thousands of armored boots hitting the dry earth. The knights rode at the front, their capes snapping in the wind like banners of pride. Every few miles, a soldier would glance back at the covered trebuchets trailing behind the column. They whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the strange wooden frames. To the soldiers, Eirik was a freak who drew maps of ghosts and death. Jarl Haukvaldr rode alongside the wagon, his hand resting on the pommel of his blade. He did not look at the boy, but his posture was rigid and alert. The capital's outer walls rose from the horizon, a jagged teeth line of gray stone and iron. The scouts signaled a halt as the vanguard reached the edge of the killing fields. Lady Sigrun Greet appeared on her white charger, her armor polished to a mirror finish. She gestured toward the gatehouse with a gloved hand. She declared that the knights would break the gate with pure kinetic force. The knights lowered their lances, their bodies glowing with a faint, rhythmic hum of mana. They charged forward, a wave of steel crashing against the silent, looming stone. The impact shook the ground, but the wall did not even tremble. A ripple of blue light flared across the gate, absorbing the kinetic strike with ease. The knights were thrown backward, their armor sparking as the defensive wards retaliated. Eirik pulled the damp cloth from his eyes, his vision blurred by the lingering migraine. He squinted at the wall, the architect's eye flickering to life against his will. Blue heat maps washed over the fortifications, revealing the secrets hidden in the masonry. He saw the keystone of the central arch glowing with a sickening, unstable violet hue. The entire structure relied on a single, flawed joint deep within the bedrock. He scrambled out of the wagon, his boots sinking into the churned mud. He shouted for the squires to release the locking pins on the primary engine. The squires hesitated, looking toward the chaos of the retreating knights. Sigrun rode toward him, her face twisted in a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. She warned him that he had no authority to deploy his machines during a nightly charge. Eirik ignored her, his eyes locked on the violet pulsing of the gatehouse. He shoved a Squire aside and grabbed the tension release lever himself. His hands shook, the skin raw and bleeding from the previous day's labor. He yanked the lever downward with every ounce of strength in his aching frame. The trebuchet groaned, the heavy timber frame shivering under the immense stored torque. The projectile launched, a massive boulder wrapped in iron chains. It cut a perfect, whistling arc through the smoke-filled air above the battlefield. The knights below froze, their gazes tracking the dark shape as it descended. It struck the central arch with the precision of a surgeon's needle. The violet light in the keystone shattered, replaced by a blinding, jagged flash. The stone groaned, a low, tectonic sound that silenced the screams of the dying. The entire gatehouse folded inward, the massive blocks of granite tumbling like children's toys. A cloud of white dust exploded outward, swallowing the front line of the army. Silence fell over the field, broken only by the settling of heavy stone. Eirik collapsed against the wheel of the trebuchet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His vision went dark, the heat maps fading into a sea of static. He felt the cold sweat dripping down his spine as his heart hammered against his ribs. Jarl Hauk stood atop a ridge, watching the carnage with a look of dawning terror. He looked at the boy in the mud, then at the ruin of the capital's pride. Lady Sigrun remained motionless, her horse pacing nervously in the settling dust. She looked at her own hands, then at the broken gate, her composure finally fracturing. She realized that the era of the night was ending in a pile of rubble. Eirik tried to stand, but his legs refused to hold his weight. He looked at the keep, identifying the next structural flaw in the high tower. The tower leaned at an impossible angle, held together by nothing but ancient, failing mortar. If he fired again, the entire keep would collapse onto the inner courtyard. He knew the cost would be his sight, perhaps his life, but he could not stop. He signaled the squires to reload, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. The squires stared at him, their fear replaced by a strange, sudden devotion. They began to crank the winch, their muscles straining against the heavy ropes. Hawk walked toward Eirik, his armor splattered with the dust of the fallen gate. He asked if the boy could hit the tower from this distance. Eirik nodded, his eyes fixed on the heat maps dancing in his ruined vision. He calculated the wind speed and the trajectory of the falling debris. The air around the trebuchet grew cold, the smell of ozone thick and suffocating. He adjusted the angle of the arm, his fingers tracing the cold iron of the lever. He felt the migraine tearing through his skull like a sharpened blade. He did not scream, though his teeth were ground to white dust. He pulled the release, the machine jumping with a metallic, bone-jarring thud. The projectile arched high, catching the morning light as it soared toward the tower. It struck the base of the spire, the impact echoing like a thunderclap. The stone crumbled, the tower twisting as it succumbed to the laws of gravity. It fell backward, smashing into the royal barracks with a sound of utter finality. The capital's defenses were not breached by magic, but by the simple logic of weight. Eirik slumped into the mud, his consciousness finally slipping away into the black. He heard the distant cheering of the squires, a sound of triumph he could not share. He felt Hauk's hand on his shoulder, firm and unmoving. The Jarl was no longer looking at the enemy, but at the weapon he had unleashed. The war had changed, and there was no going back to the way things were. Eirik let his head rest in the dirt, the world finally falling into a cold, dark peace. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of violet as the sun dipped behind the jagged spires of the capital. Eirik stood amidst the wreckage of the forward camp, his hands trembling against the cool iron of the trebuchet. He closed his eyes, forcing his consciousness to sink into the cold, analytical depths of the architect's eye. The world vanished, replaced by a sprawling web of glowing, translucent lines that mapped the density of every stone. He focused his gaze on the main keep, a monolithic structure of reinforced granite and ancient binding runes. Deep within the masonry, a single seam pulsed with a rhythmic, unstable heat that defied the laws of structural integrity. The keystone of the central arch flickered in his vision, its thermal signature shifting from a steady amber to a violent, erratic white. Blood trickled from his left nostril, staining his ragged squire's tunic with a dark, metallic smear. He ignored the blinding migraine that hammered against his temples like a blacksmith's heavy maul. Every detail of the wall's internal stress points burned itself into his memory with agonizing clarity. He could see the exact angle required to shatter the foundation, a calculation that required absolute, unwavering focus. His vision fractured into jagged shards of static, the world blurring at the edges of his sight. He tried to steady his breathing, but his lungs burned with the effort of maintaining the connection. Around him, the camp dissolved into a haze of gray shadows and muffled, distant shouting. The enemy knights emerged from the gate, their armor shimmering with the faint blue glow of kinetic reinforcement. They moved in a synchronized, lethal phalanx, their swords drawn and reflecting the dying light of the afternoon. Jarl Hauk Valdres stood at the front of the line, his hand resting on the hilt of his heavy broadsword. He watched the knights closing the distance, his jaw set in a line of grim, iron determination. Eirik pointed a shaking finger toward the keep, his voice barely rising above the rhythmic thud of approaching boots. He signaled the precise coordinate, the focal point where the structure held the least resistance against the laws of physics. His knees buckled, his legs failing to support the crushing weight of his own exhausted frame. The world turned to pitch black, the architect's eye finally severing its link as his consciousness slipped into the void. He collapsed into the mud, his face landing inches from a discarded rusted iron spike. The knights reached the perimeter of the camp, their boots churning the earth into a thick, suffocating paste. They lunged forward, their blades singing through the air with the unnatural speed of mana-infused steel. Jarl Hauk Valdres stepped between the fallen Squire and the first wave of the charging vanguard. He drew his blade in a single fluid motion, the steel ringing out with a sharp, defiant challenge. The Jarl parried a blow from a knight, the force of the impact sending a ripple of energy through the mud. He did not look back at Eirik, his eyes locked on the cold, featureless visors of the capital's elite. The Jarl knew the Squire's value outweighed the lives of a dozen seasoned infantrymen. He braced his feet against the uneven ground, his shoulders tensing for the brutal, inevitable collision. The knights converged, their numbers creating a wall of steel that blocked out the horizon. Hauk roared a command to his men, his voice cutting through the chaotic din of the battlefield. He moved with the practiced grace of a commander who had survived 100 hopeless skirmishes. His sword deflected a strike directed at his throat, the metal screeching as it slid along his pauldron. Behind him, Eirik lay motionless, his breathing shallow and erratic against the cold, unyielding earth. The Jarl shifted his weight, creating a defensive arc that shielded the unconscious boy from the encroaching blades. He understood that if Eirik died, the siege would end in the same stagnant failure that had defined the kingdom for generations. The knights pressed their advantage, their mana-hardened armor glowing brighter as they prepared a final, crushing push. Hauk felt the strain in his own muscles, the familiar ache of a body pushed beyond its natural limits. He looked at the keep, then at the fallen architect, and made his choice. He would hold this position until the last drop of blood drained from his veins. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and wet iron as the lines prepared to clash. Hauk stepped into the heart of the fray, his blade flashing as he met the first strike of the enemy. The war had descended into a brutal, singular point of contact where destiny rested on the edge of a sword. Sunlight filtered through the coarse, off-white canvas of the field tent. Eirik blinked, but the world remained a smear of gray and muted amber. He reached a hand toward the wooden cot, his fingers trembling against the rough, splintered edge. A sharp, stabbing pain radiated from behind his eyes, settling into the familiar, crushing weight of a migraine. He remembered the trebuchet, the stone, and the terrifying crystalline clarity of the architect's eye. Now his vision felt like a blurred watercolor painting left out in the rain. He sat up slowly, his lungs rattling with a dry, metallic cough. The tent flap rustled open, letting in the harsh, biting wind of the Oakhaven plains. Jarl Hauk Valdres entered, his heavy plate armor clanking with a rhythmic, somber cadence. The Jarl stopped at the foot of the cot, his face etched with deep, weary lines of concern. He held a wooden bowl of thin, tasteless broth in his calloused, battle-scarred hands. Eirik looked at the Jarl, struggling to focus on the jagged scar running across the commander's chin. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was lined with rusted iron filings. The Jarl set the bowl down and leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. He warned Eirik to keep his voice down, as the camp was crawling with royal inquisitors. Eirik gestured to his own eyes, his hand shaking as he mimicked the sensation of burning. The Jarl sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his heavy, fur-lined mantle. He explained that the capital had officially claimed the success of the siege engine for themselves. Lady Sigrun Greet had presented the blueprints to the king as her own divine revelation. The Jarl's eyes hardened as he spoke of the political machinations unfolding in the royal court. He told Eirik that the king viewed the Squire not as a genius, but as a dangerous, unstable anomaly. Eirik gripped the edge of his cot, his knuckles turning a pale, bloodless white. He realized that his life's work had been stolen, leaving him with nothing but a broken body. The Jarl reached into his tunic and produced a small, leather-bound scroll sealed with black wax. He pressed it into Eirik's palm, his grip firm and desperate. It was a list of names, the few remaining officers who still questioned the lady's sudden tactical brilliance. Outside the tent, the heavy, rhythmic march of armored boots signaled the arrival of a royal patrol. The Jarl stood up, his hand reflexively dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. He whispered that Eirik must disappear before the sun reached its zenith. Eirik looked toward the tent entrance, his vision swirling with dark, pulsing spots of static. He knew the architect's eye had cost him his ability to see the world with precision. The Jarl checked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale blue glow of knightly mana. He turned back, his expression a mask of grim, resolute duty. He promised to create a distraction, a loud, chaotic brawl near the supply lines to draw the guards away. Eirik nodded, his head throbbing with every slight movement of his neck. He reached for his meager pack, his fingers brushing against the cold, familiar texture of his drafting compass. The Jarl stepped out into the biting wind, leaving Eirik alone in the dim, suffocating silence of the tent. Eirik stood up, his legs buckling briefly before he caught his balance against a tent pole. He took a ragged breath, the air smelling of wet earth and the distant, metallic tang of ozone. He stepped out of the tent, his eyes squinting against the harsh, unforgiving glare of the midday sun. The camp was a hive of activity, with soldiers sharpening blades and polishing their mana-infused pauldrons. He saw Lady Sigrun Greet standing near the command pavilion, her silk robes fluttering in the wind. She was laughing with a group of high-ranking officers, her hands gesturing with practiced, elegant grace. Eirik ducked behind a stack of supply crates, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched as a detachment of royal guards marched past, their armor shimmering with the faint blue flicker of kinetic reinforcement. He needed to reach the tree line, a thin, dark smudge of green against the horizon. His vision blurred again, the world tilting at an impossible, sickening angle. He felt the familiar cold pressure of the architect's eye attempting to activate, but he forced his mind to remain blank. He could not afford another migraine, not while his life hung by such a fragile, fraying thread. He moved through the shadows of the supply wagons, his movements slow and deliberate. A shout erupted from the opposite side of the camp, followed by the clatter of dropped spears. The Jarl had kept his word, starting a confrontation that rippled through the ranks of the waiting soldiers. The guards near the pavilion turned toward the commotion, their faces tightening with sudden, focused alarm. Eirik sprinted, his boots thumping softly against the damp, churned mud of the encampment floor. He reached the edge of the camp, where the tall, swaying grasses of the plains began. He did not look back, even as he heard the sharp, authoritative bark of Lady Sigrun's voice. He dove into the tall grass, his body aching as he scrambled toward the shelter of the dense, encroaching forest. The world seemed to sharpen for a fleeting second, the colors of the grass appearing vivid and hauntingly beautiful. He realized then that he was no longer a squire, but a ghost haunting the edges of a war he had helped to ignite. He crawled through the undergrowth, his clothes snagging on thorns and jagged dry twigs. His eyes stung, a hot, liquid heat leaking from the corners of his eyelids. He touched his face, his fingers coming away stained with a dark, wet smudge of blood. The cost of his vision was absolute, but the logic of his survival remained clear and cold. He reached the base of an ancient oak tree, its gnarled roots forming a small hidden hollow. He curled up inside, his breath hitching as he listened to the distant, chaotic sounds of the camp. He opened the scroll the Jarl had given him, though the characters danced and blurred before his failing sight. He traced the ink with his fingertip, memorizing the shape of the names through touch alone. He had become a liability, a secret that needed to be erased to protect the lady's stolen glory. He closed his eyes, the darkness of the hollow offering a small, temporary sanctuary. He knew he would never see the world with the same clarity again, but the blueprint for his revenge remained etched in his mind. He would rebuild, not with machines of war, but with the fragile, enduring strength of the truth. The forest remained silent, the leaves whispering secrets to the wind as the sun began its slow, inevitable descent. Eirik lay in the dirt, his body still, his heart a steady, determined drumbeat in the dark. He was the architect of his own survival, and he would not be broken by the corrupt steel of the capital. He drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, his hand gripping the compass as if it were a weapon. The war would continue, but for the first time, he saw the path forward without the help of his failing, magical sight. The shadows lengthened, stretching like long, hungry fingers across the floor of the forest. He waited for the stars to emerge, his mind already calculating the next necessary move in a game he had only just begun to play. The royal forge glowed with a sickly violet light. Huge metal ribs curved like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast. Eirik stood in the shadows of the rafters, his breath shallow. He watched the king's engineers weld plates of enchanted steel together. The machine hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that rattled his teeth. He recognized the geometry of the primary tension spring. It was his own design, stripped of its safety governors. The king intended to focus kinetic energy into a single, devastating beam. Such power would liquefy stone and marrow alike. Eirik gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles turning white. The architect's eye throbbed behind his eyelids, bleeding heat into his skull. He saw the structural stress points glowing in an angry, jagged red. The device was a murder machine built on the logic of his own brilliance. A shadow shifted near the cooling basin. A young woman in the gray robes of a sorcerer's apprentice stepped forward. She carried a heavy tray of cooling salts, her face tight with resentment. Eirik recognized her as the girl who cleaned Lady Sigrun Grit's private study. He dropped from the rafters, landing silently in the soot-stained straw. The girl jumped, her hands shaking as she nearly spilled the salts. He pressed a finger to his lips, his gaze hard and urgent. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and recognition. He pointed to the massive, pulsating engine in the center of the room. He mimed a snapping motion, a jagged line of failure cutting through the air. The girl nodded slowly, her expression shifting from fear to a cold, shared fury. She whispered that Lady Sigrun Greit enjoyed watching the commoners beg for mercy. She gestured toward the master gear, currently unguarded by the royal smiths. Eirik crept toward the central axle, his boots avoiding the discarded scrap. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and burnt copper. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small iron wedge. It was a precise tool he had fashioned during his long nights in the tent. He jammed the metal into the gear's primary load-bearing joint. The machine groaned as the rotation forced the iron into the soft, enchanted brass. A hairline fracture appeared on the surface of the gear. It glowed with a faint, warning pulse of orange light. Eirik stepped back, his heart hammering against his chest like a trapped bird. The girl watched the door, her hand resting on a heavy iron pry bar. She signaled that the guards were turning the corner of the hallway. Heavy footsteps echoed against the stone floor. The royal guards marched past the doorway, their armor clanking in perfect rhythmic unison. Eirik pressed himself against the cold, damp stone of the wall. He saw the king's head engineer enter the forge, his eyes scanning the machinery. The engineer paused, his gaze lingering on the modified axle. He approached the engine, his hand hovering over the cooling salts. Eirik held his breath, his eyes tracing the path of the impending collapse. The engineer frowned, sensing the imbalance in the machine's complex magical hum. He reached out to touch the gear, his fingers grazing the iron wedge. The girl suddenly stepped forward, shouting that she had found a leak in the coolant line. The engineer turned, distracted by the sudden, sharp sound of her voice. He walked toward her, his face twisted into a mask of impatient authority. The girl pointed to the back of the chamber, leading him away from the engine. Eirik seized the moment, darting toward the shadows near the southern exit. He glanced back one last time at his creation. It was a masterpiece of physics, now perverted into a tool of absolute tyranny. He reached the heavy iron door and slipped into the cool night air. The castle walls loomed above him, damp and imposing in the moonlight. He felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on his shoulders. He had provided the blueprint for the slaughter of his own people. The girl emerged from the forge moments later, her face pale. She caught up to him, her breathing ragged and irregular. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the lower palace. The stone here was cold, untouched by the warmth of the royal hearths. Eirik stopped at a junction, his eyes searching for the path to the stables. The girl grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong and desperate. She pulled him into a small alcove hidden behind a velvet tapestry. She whispered that they were being followed by the palace inquisitors. Eirik looked at her, his eyes searching for a sign of deception. She handed him a small, sealed scroll marked with the king's personal seal. She claimed it contained the true location of the king's hidden armory. Eirik took the scroll, his fingers brushing against the rough, expensive parchment. A sudden, sharp metallic click echoed in the narrow corridor. Eirik spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his hidden compass. A dozen royal guards blocked the path, their spears lowered and leveled. Lady Sigrun Greit stood at the center of the formation, her expression cold. She looked at Eirik with a mixture of pity and utter clinical detachment. The girl by his side stepped away, her posture shifting from fear to rigid, soldierly obedience. She smoothed her robes, her eyes meeting Sigrun's with a faint, smug smile. Eirik looked at the scroll in his hand, then back at the trap. The girl had led him here, her betrayal as sharp as a serrated blade. He understood the game now, the cost of his misplaced trust clear in the silence. Lady Sigrun Greit motioned for the guards to advance. The corridors of the palace seemed to shrink, closing in around his final, desperate hope. The iron gate slammed shut with a final heavy thud. Eirik Vollen stumbled into the damp darkness of the subterranean forge. Two royal guards shoved him forward, their armored shoulders pressing against his back. Lady Sigrun Greit stepped into the dim light of a flickering torch. She watched him with eyes that held the cold precision of a sharpened blade. The royal smiths stood in the shadows, their hammers silent and heavy. A massive, partially completed siege engine dominated the center of the chamber. Its brass gears were etched with glowing blue sigils of kinetic reinforcement. Sigrun gestured toward the central axle with a gloved hand. She ordered him to finish the calibration before the morning bell. Eirik looked at the machine, his architect's eye twitching behind closed lids. Thermal signatures bled through the metal, revealing the instability of the design. The engine was a monster of forced physics, hungry for more mana. He knelt on the cold stone floor, reaching for a set of iron calipers. His fingers brushed the rough surface of the primary gear. He knew the king's engineers had failed to account for the vibration frequency. One wrong turn would cause the entire structure to shatter like brittle glass. He began to work, his movements slow and deliberate under the guard's gaze. He filed a microscopic notch into the base of the secondary drive shaft. It was a structural virus, hidden in the geometry of the load-bearing joint. He calculated the exact harmonic frequency required to trigger the collapse. The guards shifted their weight, the clank of their plate armor echoing in the chamber. Sigrun paced the perimeter, her boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. She stopped behind him, her shadow stretching long over his workbench. She asked him why the metal glowed with such a sickly, uneven hue. Eirik kept his head bowed, his voice steady as he explained the load distribution. He claimed the brass needed to be tempered by the friction of the rotation. He pointed to a dummy gear, feigning a need for more cooling salts. Sigrun signaled a smith, who grunted and stepped toward the heavy supply barrels. Eirik watched the man's movements, his mind racing through the physics of the trap. The smith dumped a handful of salt onto the glowing brass. A plume of white smoke hissed into the stale, underground air. Eirik adjusted the iron wedge, locking the mechanical virus into the frame. He felt the familiar sharp sting of a migraine blooming behind his eyes. The architect's eye flickered, displaying waves of red stress heat across the axle. He forced his breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. If he collapsed now, they would surely execute him on the spot. He stood up, wiping the grease from his hands onto his tattered tunic. He stepped back from the engine, his legs trembling from the exertion. Sigrun walked forward, her eyes scanning the complex web of gears. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from the sabotaged joint. Eirik held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The lady's fingers brushed the brass, but she sensed nothing of the hidden flaw. She smiled, a thin and dangerous expression that did not reach her eyes. She declared the machine ready for the final test at dawn. The guards grabbed his arms, dragging him toward the dark mouth of a holding cell. He glanced back at the engine, his creation waiting to devour itself. The heavy door groaned on rusted hinges as they pushed him inside. He fell onto the straw-covered floor, the darkness swallowing him whole. He closed his eyes, his vision swimming with the ghostly heat maps of the forge. The mechanical virus was set, waiting for the first rotation of the gears. He listened to the muffled sounds of the guards pacing in the hall. He felt the weight of his own betrayal pressing against his weary chest. He had built a weapon of destruction to save a city that feared him. The silence of the cell was heavy, broken only by the distant drip of water. He curled into a ball, his hands shaking in the cold, damp air. His ocular hemorrhaging flared, painting his vision in shades of jagged, pulsing red. He needed to survive until the morning light reached the palace walls. The king would command the engine to fire at the rebel lines. The machine would groan, its gears screaming against the impossible stress. Then, the primary axle would snap, sending the brass shrapnel into the crowd. Eirik drifted into a fitful sleep, his mind still mapping the trajectory of the ruin. The morning bells rang out, a discordant chime that echoed through the stone halls. The door to his cell swung open, revealing the stern face of a royal guard. He was hauled to his feet and marched back toward the central forge. The room was filled with the elite knights of Oakhaven, their armor polished to a mirror sheen. Lady Sigrun Grit stood on a raised dais, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. The king's chief engineer stood beside the engine, his face flushed with pride. He signaled for the smiths to activate the core's kinetic flow. The engine began to hum, a deep vibration that rattled the loose stones in the floor. Eirik watched from the corner, his heart cold as he waited for the failure. The gear began to turn, its rotation picking up speed with every passing second. The blue light grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The engineer adjusted the control lever, pushing the machine to its absolute limit. Eirik saw the thermal signature of the notch he had filed. It was glowing a deep, angry crimson as the heat concentrated on the fracture. The machine's hum shifted, rising into a high-pitched, discordant whine. The knights stepped back, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. Sigrun frowned, her eyes narrowing as the engine began to shudder violently. The metal groaned, a sound like grinding teeth that filled the entire chamber. Eirik stepped back, his back pressing against the cold, unyielding stone of the wall. The primary gear wobbled, its path no longer true as the stress fractured the brass. A spark showered the room, followed by the sound of snapping iron. The engine buckled inward, the force of its own power tearing it apart. The knights shouted in alarm, diving for cover as the brass casing exploded. Shrapnel whistled through the air, embedding itself deep into the stone pillars. Sigrun threw up a shield of shimmering mana, her face twisted in sudden fury. The king's engineer was thrown backward, his body crashing into the heavy supply barrels. Dust and smoke billowed through the room, obscuring the chaos of the collapse. Eirik didn't wait for the air to clear. He turned and sprinted toward the southern exit, his boots sliding on the debris. He heard the roar of the knights behind him, their voices thick with rage. He reached the heavy door, throwing his weight against the iron latch. It swung open, revealing the gray, misty light of the palace courtyard. He plunged into the shadows, his lungs burning with every desperate breath. He was a ghost in the labyrinth of the palace, his mission now a race against time. The explosion had bought him a moment, but he knew Sigrun would not stop. He looked up at the towering walls, his mind already calculating the path of least resistance. His vision was fading, the architect's eye exhausted by the strain of the day. He pressed forward, guided by the memory of the blueprints he had once drawn. The betrayal was complete, but the war for Oakhaven had only just begun. The king stood upon the high balcony overlooking the proving grounds. He held a crystal vial filled with a thick, pulsating crimson liquid. Below him, the massive siege engine groaned under the weight of its own iron plating. Eirik watched from the shadows of a stone archway, his breath hitching in his chest. The machine was a masterpiece of lethal intent, designed to shatter under its own tension. He knew the structural integrity of the primary axle was compromised. The king uncorked the vial and poured the blood magic directly into the engine's core. A sickening, wet sound echoed across the courtyard as the fluid seeped into the gears. The iron plates began to pulse with a rhythmic, organic heartbeat. Eirik gripped the cold stone of the archway, his knuckles turning white. The machine was supposed to tear itself apart the moment the rotation reached top speed. Instead, the brass gears fused together with a screech of tortured metal. A wave of forbidden energy rippled outward, distorting the air like heat rising from a desert road. The king laughed, a hollow sound that carried no warmth. The engine began to spin, its movement defying the laws of gravity and friction. It hummed with a low, predatory vibration that made the ground tremble. Eirik squinted, his architect's eye struggling to process the impossible geometry of the core. The heat maps usually showed stress fractures in vibrant, logical colors. Now the engine glowed with an unnatural, sickly violet hue. The structural flaws were being forcibly mended by the blood magic, sealing the cracks with solidified gore. He realized his carefully calculated sabotage had been rendered obsolete by the ritual. The king had replaced engineering with a parasitic magical vitality. The machine pivoted, its heavy barrel locking onto a row of wooden training dummies. It fired without the need for a secondary tension release. A bolt of pure, solidified kinetic force tore through the air. The targets were obliterated into fine sawdust before the sound of the blast even reached the spectators. The king turned his gaze toward the far wall of the courtyard. He gestured with a gloved hand, signaling for a second, more powerful volley. Eirik felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The machine was not just functioning. It was evolving into something far more dangerous. It was no longer a tool of war built on physical principles. It was a weapon fueled by the very essence of the life it sought to destroy. The king's guards stood at attention, their armor reflecting the unnatural violet light of the engine. They looked at the machine with a mix of awe and terror. Eirik knew he had to leave the courtyard before he was spotted. He pressed his back against the rough masonry, moving slowly toward the outer gate. His ocular hemorrhaging flared, painting his vision in jagged, pulsing red spikes. He ignored the blinding pain, focusing on the rhythmic thumping of the engine's core. The machine drew power from the surrounding area, draining the color from the nearby grass and stone. Everything it touched turned brittle and gray. He realized the king was planning to use this device to drain the life from the entire city. It was a siege engine that didn't just break walls, but consumed the foundation of reality itself. The king stepped down from the balcony, his eyes fixed on the pulsating engine. He walked with the heavy, arrogant stride of a man who owned the future. Eirik slipped through the shadows of the servants' corridor, his boots making no sound on the damp floor. He needed to reach Jarl Hauk before the king deployed this horror against the rebel lines. The palace walls felt like a prison, their structural integrity now warped by the lingering magical residue. Every stone seemed to vibrate with the engine's unnatural pulse. He reached the heavy iron door leading to the lower stables. He pulled the latch, the metal cold and biting against his blistered palms. The stables were empty, the horses spooked by the strange energy radiating from the courtyard. He found his mare huddled in the corner, her coat matted with sweat. He mounted the beast, his vision swimming with the ghostly heat maps of the palace's structural weaknesses. He saw the cracks in the foundation, now glowing with that same sickly violet light. The king was tethered to the machine by a thin, glowing thread of blood magic. As long as the king lived, the engine would remain fueled by his dark ambition. Eirik urged the mare forward, galloping out into the gray, misty light of the Oakhaven outskirts. He looked back once, seeing the engine glowing like a dying star above the palace spires. The sky overhead turned a bruised, unnatural purple. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and ozone. He rode hard, his mind racing to find a way to counter a force that ignored the rules of physics. He had studied load-bearing stress, but he had never studied the mechanics of a curse. The wind whipped against his face, carrying the distant rhythmic thumping of the engine. It followed him like a heartbeat, relentless and hungry. He knew the rebel lines were only a few hours away. If the king's forces reached them first, there would be nothing left to save. Jarl Hauk would try to fight the machine with steel and courage. He would not understand that he was facing something that could not be broken by conventional means. Eirik pushed the mare faster, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in his eyes. He had to be the one to break the machine, even if it meant breaking himself in the process. The road ahead was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. He steered by memory, his architect's eye still mapping the terrain in shades of jagged red. He reached the ridge overlooking the rebel encampment. The tents were scattered across the valley, a small, desperate gathering of people who still believed in freedom. Jarl Hauk was standing by the central campfire, his armor dull and dented from weeks of fighting. He looked up as Eirik approached, his expression hardening. Eirik slid from the saddle, his legs buckling beneath him. He stumbled forward, his vision fading into a wall of absolute, suffocating darkness. He reached out, his hand finding the rough fabric of Hauk's cloak. He gasped for air, the words catching in his dry throat. The king had found a new way to fuel the engine, he whispered. It was not iron and tension anymore, but something alive and hungry. Hauk caught him by the shoulders, his grip firm and steady. He looked toward the palace, his jaw set in a grim, resolute line. The king would not stop, Hauk said, his voice low and dangerous. They would have to take the engine from him before he could turn it on the people. Eirik nodded, his head drooping against Hauk's chest. He felt the weight of his own failure pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating mantle. The night air grew colder, the violet light from the palace casting long, distorted shadows across the camp. The rebellion had reached its final, most desperate hour. The machine was a perversion of everything he had built. He had set out to design a weapon for liberation, but he had only provided the blueprint for a nightmare. He closed his eyes, his mind mapping the trajectory of the ruin. He had to find the keystone of the king's power, the point where the blood magic met the cold, hard reality of the machine. He would need to be close, closer than he had ever been before. He would need to look into the heart of the engine and find the fracture he had missed. The camp settled into a tense, uneasy silence. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of the engine, a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over them. Eirik lay on the cold ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He watched the stars above, their light obscured by the thickening violet haze. He was the architect, and he had built a monster. Now he had to dismantle it, one gear, one spell, and one broken heart at a time. The morning would bring the final confrontation. He prepared his mind for the task, setting aside the fear that clawed at his resolve. He would not let the king win. He would use his knowledge, his logic, and the last of his sight to shatter the foundation of the crown. The engine continued to pulse in the distance, a beacon of dark intent. Eirik drifted into a light, fitful sleep, his dreams filled with the grinding of gears and the scent of blood. He was ready to finish what he had started. The trap had been set, but the hunter was about to become the prey. The massive siege engine groaned under the weight of the ritual. Violet lightning arced across the wooden frame, searing the air with the smell of ozone. The machine's main gear spun in reverse, grinding against the laws of mechanics. It tore a hole in the fabric of the air, pulling the ambient mana from the surrounding masonry. Eirik watched the city walls begin to liquefy. The stone blocks turned translucent, vibrating with a high-pitched, screeching hum. He gripped his staff, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The mortar between the bricks crumbled into fine gray powder. He saw the structural integrity of the capital's keep falling to zero. His architect's eye flickered, painting the world in jagged, terrifying shades of red. The palace walls were not just collapsing, they were being consumed. The engine drew the very essence of the stone into its hungry maw. Jarl Hauk stood at the front of the formation, his hand resting on his sword hilt. He watched the enemy gates disintegrate, his face alight with a grim, predatory satisfaction. The king's forces were trapped behind their own melting fortifications. Hauk turned to his men, his voice booming across the silent, terrified battlefield. He ordered the advance, convinced the path to victory lay in the rubble. Eirik stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the softened, pulpy earth. He grabbed Hauk's heavy leather pauldron, pulling the commander back. The walls were the fuel, he gasped, his vision blurring with sharp, stabbing pain. If the engine continued to feed, it would eventually target the ground beneath their feet. Hauk shook him off, his eyes fixed on the crumbling heart of the palace. He told Eirik that the war was finally ending in their favor. He refused to see the violet light spreading like rot through the foundation. Eirik looked up at the spires, seeing the cracks spiderwebbing across the highest towers. The palace was a massive, ornate battery, and the engine was draining it dry. He realized the blood magic required a rigid structure to maintain its tether. Without the walls to anchor the spell, the energy would lash out in a chaotic surge. The engine emitted a deep, rhythmic thumping that rattled Eirik's very teeth. He watched a group of commoners fleeing from the base of the crumbling keep. They were crushed under falling, liquefied stone that hardened instantly upon impact. The invention he had built to break chains was now shattering the world. He felt the weight of his own hubris pressing down on his chest. He had focused on the physics of the siege, ignoring the volatile nature of the fuel. The violet haze intensified, swirling around the engine like a suffocating shroud. Hawk drew his blade, leading the charge toward the swirling, unstable vortex. Eirik stood alone in the mud, watching the commander disappear into the shifting gloom. He reached for his remaining strength, his eyes straining to focus on the engine's core. There was a hairline fracture in the containment ring, glowing with a pulsating intensity. If he could strike that point, he might collapse the machine before it leveled the city. He pulled a heavy iron spike from his belt, his fingers shaking with exhaustion. He moved toward the engine, his steps uneven and heavy with impending dread. The heat radiating from the machine blistered the skin on his arms. He saw the king standing on the ramparts, his face twisted in a mask of dark ecstasy. The king did not care that his kingdom was dissolving into raw, magical waste. Eirik ignored the pain, his gaze fixed on the glowing violet fracture. He threw the spike with every ounce of his remaining strength. It struck the metal ring, sparking with a shower of white molten light. The machine buckled, the rhythmic thumping turning into a discordant, jagged roar. The walls of the city groaned, the sound echoing like a dying giant. Eirik fell to his knees, his vision finally giving way to absolute static blackness. He heard the world shattering around him as the foundation of the crown dissolved. He lay in the dirt, the smell of ozone and wet stone thick in his throat. The rebellion had won the battle, but the cost was a city turned to ash. He listened to the silence that followed, a heavy, suffocating stillness. The engine was gone, but the foundation of the world had been forever altered. The iron cell door groaned on rusted hinges. Eirik stumbled into the damp corridor, his breath hitching in the cold air. He leaned against the wet stone wall to steady his trembling legs. His vision remained clouded, a gray fog of lingering fatigue from his final desperate strike. Shadows stretched across the dungeon floor like grasping fingers. He moved toward the flickering torchlight at the end of the hall. The heavy scent of mildew and stagnant water filled his nostrils. He stepped over a discarded shackle, the metal clinking softly against the floor. A guard lay slumped in the corner, his armor dulled by layers of grime. Eirik crept past the sleeping man, his boots silent on the slick stone. He reached the heavy wooden gate leading to the lower city. The lock was primitive, a simple sliding bolt that defied the kingdom's obsession with complex magical seals. He shifted the bolt with a sharp click and pushed the gate outward. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The narrow alleyways of the capital were cloaked in a thick, suffocating mist. Eirik moved through the shadows, his hand tracing the rough texture of the brickwork. Every building he passed revealed its structural history to his lingering, fractured perception. He saw the stress lines in the crumbling mortar, the weight of the city pressing down on its impoverished foundations. A group of laborers huddled near a gutter, their faces gaunt under tattered hoods. They looked up as he emerged from the darkness. One man squinted, his eyes widening in sudden, sharp recognition. He whispered a name, the sound passing through the group like a spark in dry grass. Eirik saw the way they stood straighter, their hollow chests expanding with a renewed, dangerous energy. He was no longer just a squire in their eyes. He was the man who had shattered the invulnerable walls of the royal keep. The laborers bowed their heads in a gesture of silent, desperate respect. Eirik realized his reputation had traveled faster than his escape. He walked deeper into the labyrinthine slums, the people parting to clear his path. A young girl reached out, touching the hem of his ragged tunic with trembling fingers. He saw the hope in her eyes, a fragile, burning thing that mirrored his own resolve. He understood then that his blueprints were no longer just tools for siege. He had to design a structure for their collective simmering rage. He stopped before a nondescript door covered in layers of peeling gray paint. He knocked 3 times in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern. The door swung open to reveal a cramped, candlelit basement. The room was packed with men and women, their faces etched with the weariness of a long, losing war. They held crude iron tools, their hands calloused and stained with the soot of the forge. A map of the city lay spread across a scarred wooden table. It was marked with red ink, highlighting the vulnerabilities he had once used to destroy the walls. The leader of the group, a woman with a jagged scar across her brow, stepped forward. She pointed to the keep, her finger tracing the path of the main structural supports. She asked him how they could bring the entire foundation down without the use of high-cost mana. Eirik stepped to the table, his fingers lingering over the paper. He traced the keystone of the palace, the hidden point where gravity did the work of an army. The resistance members leaned in, their breathing shallow and synchronized. He spoke of leverage, of friction, and of the simple, unyielding laws of physics. He explained that the crown's power relied on the belief that their walls were eternal. He showed them the cracks in the masonry, the places where the stone groaned under its own hubris. The room remained silent, the only sound the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. He realized they were waiting for him to provide the blueprint for their freedom. He looked at their faces, seeing the potential for a revolution built on logic rather than blood. The woman nodded, her expression hardening into a mask of cold, calculated purpose. She pulled a heavy iron lever from beneath the table, placing it firmly in his hands. Eirik gripped the cold metal, feeling the weight of the coming storm. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the damp stone walls. Outside, the city slept, unaware that the architect of its ruin had returned to redraw the lines. He began to draft the plan, his hand moving with a newfound, steady precision. The resistance watched, their eyes fixed on the ink as it traced the end of the old regime. He knew the cost would be high, but the foundation was already failing. The revolution had begun, one structural calculation at a time. Eirik spread a fresh sheet of parchment across the scarred wooden table. He pressed a charcoal stick into the surface with steady, practiced fingers. The candle flame flickered, casting long shadows of his hand against the wall. He drew the precise cross-section of a standard Oakhaven watchtower. Around him, a dozen commoners leaned in, their faces illuminated by the dim light. They were not soldiers, but laborers who had spent their lives hauling stone for the crown. Eirik pointed to a small, shaded triangle at the base of the tower's foundation. He explained that every structure possessed a single point of failure. He told them the weight of the stone above sought the path of least resistance. A woman with calloused hands traced the line he had drawn on the paper. She asked if they truly needed no mana to bring such a wall down. Eirik shook his head, his eyes scanning the diagram for any hidden flaws. He described how gravity acted as an unyielding, invisible hammer. He showed them how a simple iron wedge, placed at the correct angle, could shatter a keystone. The men in the room exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from doubt to hunger. They had spent their entire lives fearing the untouchable strength of the knightly order. Now, they saw the walls of the palace as a math problem waiting to be solved. Eirik felt a sharp, familiar throb behind his left eye. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the architect's eye to remain dormant. He could not afford a migraine while he was still teaching the others. He opened his eyes and pointed to the map of the city's defensive perimeter. He instructed them to memorize the locations of the support arches near the gate. The group nodded, their voices low as they repeated the technical terminology. They were building an army that required no magic to level the playing field. Outside the basement, the night air hung heavy with the smell of coal smoke. A figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alleyway. The assassin wore a cloak of dark, oiled leather that absorbed the moonlight. He held a thin blade in his hand, the metal etched with faint, glowing runes. He crept toward the nondescript door, his boots making no sound on the wet cobbles. He stopped, his head tilting as he listened to the muffled voices inside. He recognized the tone of a man explaining something complex and dangerous. The assassin reached into his belt and pulled out a small glass vial. He poured a viscous, silver liquid onto the hinges of the basement door. The metal groaned silently as the acid ate through the iron pins. Inside, Eirik stood up and walked to the corner to sharpen a rusted chisel. He felt a sudden cold shift in the pressure of the room. He looked toward the entrance, his gaze tracing the outline of the door. He saw a thin gray mist leaking through the cracks in the wood. He realized the seal on the door had been compromised from the outside. He shoved the table toward the center of the room to act as a barricade. He shouted for the others to move to the rear exit behind the furnace. The commoners scrambled, their movements frantic but disciplined by his earlier commands. The door burst inward with a sharp, metallic snap of shattered hinges. The assassin stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space like a predator. He saw the discarded parchment and the charcoal-stained hands of the retreating group. He lunged forward, his blade carving a glowing arc through the dusty air. Eirik grabbed a heavy iron hammer from the workbench and braced his stance. He watched the assassin's movement, his architect's eye flickering to life. He saw the assassin's muscles tense, the thermal signature flaring along his arm. He knew exactly where the man would strike before the blade reached him. Eirik stepped aside, the sword whistling through the space he had occupied a second before. He swung the hammer in a short, brutal arc toward the assassin's knee. The impact resonated through the room, a heavy thud of steel against bone. The assassin stumbled, his balance shattered by the precise, mechanical force. He recovered instantly, his mana-infused armor glowing with a harsh, golden light. He lashed out with a kick, his boot catching Eirik in the ribs. Eirik flew backward, hitting the stone wall with a sickening, wet crunch. His vision blurred, a wave of agony washing over his senses. The assassin stepped over the fallen table, his sword raised for a killing blow. Eirik looked at the ceiling, his mind racing to calculate the room's remaining stability. He saw the heavy, rotting wooden beams supporting the floor of the tavern above. He saw the exact knot in the timber that held the weight of the entire structure. He gripped his hammer and hurled it with all his remaining strength. The iron head struck the beam with a deafening, resonant crack. The wood splintered, the structural integrity of the ceiling failing in an instant. Dust and debris rained down, a heavy curtain of stone and timber falling between them. The assassin leaped back, his golden armor shielding him from the collapsing rubble. Eirik rolled to the side, his lungs burning as he gasped for air. He scrambled toward the rear exit, his boots skidding on the loose stone. He heard the assassin roaring in frustration as he hacked through the fallen beams. Eirik reached the alleyway, the cold wind biting into his sweat-soaked skin. He turned back once to see the basement collapsing into a cloud of gray grit. He knew his location had been compromised, but his lesson had been delivered. The commoners were already dispersing into the labyrinthine streets of the city. They carried the knowledge of the keystone in their minds and on their hands. Eirik leaned against a damp wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. He wiped a smear of blood from his lip with a trembling hand. He realized the assassin would not stop until the architect was permanently silenced. He looked up at the silhouette of the palace keep looming over the slums. He knew the war would not be won by magic, but by the weight of the truth. He turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the ruins behind. His eyes burned, the cost of his vision mounting with every passing minute. He had taught them how to break a wall, but now he had to survive. The city was a cage, and he was the only one who knew the lock. He walked toward the river, his footsteps echoing in the empty, narrow street. He would find a new place to hide, a new foundation to build upon. The revolution was no longer a theory. It was a physical, growing reality. He looked down at his hands, seeing the dirt of the city under his nails. He was the architect of their ruin, and he was just getting started. Dust motes danced in the shafts of fading sunlight, piercing the library's high, arched windows. Eirik Vollen pressed his back against the cool stone of a bookshelf. His breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the suffocating silence of the room. He clutched a leather-bound journal to his chest, his knuckles white with strain. Across the rows of ancient, rotting scrolls, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. The assassin moved with a predatory grace, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. A thin, serrated blade caught the dim light, its edge shimmering with a faint, lethal, violet hue. Eirik's eyes widened, his pupils dilating as he activated the architect's eye. The world shifted into a stark, monochromatic map of structural stress. Golden lines pulsed through the heavy timber ceiling beams, indicating the point of terminal failure. He saw the assassin's arm muscles tighten, the mana-infused armor glowing with a dull, rhythmic hum. The man was preparing to strike, his center of gravity shifting toward his left heel. Eirik knew the exact trajectory of the coming lunge before the assassin even moved. He reached out and gripped the edge of a heavy, iron-bound cabinet. The assassin lunged, his blade slicing through the empty air where Eirik had stood a heartbeat before. Eirik swung the heavy cabinet with a sudden, desperate heave. The wood groaned, the legs catching on the uneven floorboards and tilting the entire structure. He slammed his shoulder into the side of the cabinet, forcing it to tip over. The heavy furniture crashed into the supporting pillar of the central archway. Dust exploded from the ceiling, a thick gray cloud swallowing the library in an instant. The assassin stumbled, his balance compromised by the sudden shift in the floor's geometry. Eirik did not wait for the dust to settle. He grabbed a discarded metal candelabra and swung it at the exposed, splintering wood of the beam. The iron struck the exact stress fracture he had identified with his eye. A deafening, resonant crack echoed through the vaulted hall. The entire ceiling groaned as the structural integrity of the library failed. Massive, dust-covered beams plummeted from the heights, crashing into the floor with the force of a falling mountain. The assassin screamed, a short, choked sound cut off by the weight of the debris. Eirik rolled beneath a heavy mahogany desk, his body curled into a tight, protective ball. The floor shuddered, a shockwave of impact rattling his teeth and vibrating through his very bones. Debris rained down on top of the desk, a cacophony of stone, timber, and shattering glass. Silence returned to the room, heavier and more profound than before. Eirik pushed his way out from under the splintered wood, his movements slow and agonizing. His lungs burned, the air thick with the taste of pulverized limestone and old parchment. He wiped his eyes, but a dark, wet warmth leaked from his tear ducts. He reached up, his fingers coming away stained with a mixture of blood and gray dust. The architect's eye throbbed, a white-hot spike of pain driving itself through his skull. He looked at the wreckage, but the thermal maps were flickering and fading into a dull gray blur. The world seemed to lose its color, the sharp lines of reality dissolving into soft, indistinct shapes. He tried to focus on the rubble, but the vision refused to stabilize. The assassin lay pinned beneath a jagged, splintered beam, his movement long since ceased. Eirik stumbled to his feet, his balance faltering as the room tilted dangerously to the left. He reached for a nearby shelf to steady himself, his hand trembling uncontrollably. He realized his sight was not merely obscured by dust, but failing him from within. The cost of his vision had finally come due, the price of his unnatural sight paid in full. He looked at his own hands, but he could only see the faint, ghostly outline of his skin. The library was a graveyard of knowledge, and he was the only one left to witness it. He needed to move, to find a way out before the palace guards arrived. He turned toward the doorway, his steps uneven and uncertain on the debris-strewn floor. Each movement was a struggle, his body screaming in protest against the physical toll of the collapse. He navigated by touch, his hand tracing the cold, rough surface of the wall. He stepped over a pile of fallen books, the leather covers crunching beneath his boots. The cool air of the corridor hit his face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the ruins. He leaned against the stone doorframe, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He had survived the assassin, but he was now a man adrift in a world he could no longer see. He gripped the journal tighter, the only map he had for the path ahead. The revolution would not wait for his eyes to heal. He would have to learn to build without the comfort of his golden lines. He stepped out into the night, the darkness of the city mirroring the void in his own vision. He would find his allies, even if he had to crawl the entire way. The palace keep loomed somewhere ahead, a massive, silent shadow in the night. He walked forward, his heartbeat the only rhythm he could follow in the dark. The architect had lost his sight, but the foundation of his design remained unshaken. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was far from finished. Eirik sat on a crate in the damp cellar of a weaver's shop. He held a charcoal stick in his trembling, soot-stained fingers. Across from him, 3 young squires watched the rough sketches on the table. The paper was covered in diagrams of arches, triangles, and load-bearing vectors. Eirik tapped the center of a drawing with a sharp, rhythmic motion. He explained that the stone did not care about the mana of a knight. He told them the weight of the mountain was a constant mathematical truth. One squire, a boy with calloused hands, traced the line of a stone pillar. The boy asked if he truly had to look for the color of heat. Eirik shook his head and reached out to guide the boy's hand. He told him to feel for the vibration of the stone against his palm. The boy pressed his hand against the cold, damp wall of the cellar. Eirik described the way a crack sounded before it ever appeared on the surface. He spoke of the shift in air pressure when a support began to fail. The squires stared at the wall, their brows furrowed in intense concentration. Eirik realized he was no longer teaching a secret, but a new language. His vision had faded to a gray, swirling mist at the edges of his mind. He could no longer see the thermal maps that once defined his world. The architect's eye remained dormant, a silent, broken tool behind his eyes. He traced the edges of his journal, feeling the familiar texture of the parchment. He had recorded every calculation he had ever performed in these pages. He pushed the book across the table toward the eldest squire. He told the boy that the knowledge was now a shared burden. The squire opened the book, his eyes widening at the complexity of the math. Eirik stood up, his legs wobbling as he leaned against the rough table. He walked toward the door, navigating by the steady drip of water from the eaves. The street outside was silent, save for the distant clatter of armored patrols. He could hear the rhythmic march of the iron-wrought knights on the cobblestones. He knew their patterns now, not by sight, but by the weight of their steps. A group of commoners waited in the alleyway, watching him with expectant eyes. He stood before them, a blind man leading a revolution of logic. He gestured to a pile of scrap iron and timber stacked against the wall. He told them to build a lever that could move the heavy stone gate. The men hesitated, looking at the massive, immovable slab of rock. Eirik pointed to the fulcrum point he had marked in his mind days ago. He told them that force was nothing without the correct point of application. The men grabbed the beams and wedged them beneath the stone slab. They pushed in unison, their muscles straining against the immense weight. The stone groaned, a deep, resonant sound of rock grinding against rock. It shifted, sliding an inch, then 2, before settling into a new position. The commoners cheered, a low, guttural sound of triumph echoing in the alley. Eirik stood still, his face turned toward the cool breeze of the night. He could feel the shift in the earth through the soles of his boots. He knew then that his strength had never truly been the magic itself. The eye had only been a window into the physics of the world. He had mastered the logic, and now he was giving it to the people. A hooded figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the alley. Eirik turned his head, his ears catching the soft rustle of silk fabric. He recognized the scent of lavender and ozone, the trademark of Lady Sigrun Greet. She did not speak, but the air grew heavy with the pressure of her mana. Eirik stood his ground, his hands resting on his belt. He told her that her knights were as fragile as the walls they defended. Sigrun laughed, a sharp, cold sound that cut through the night air. She stepped forward, her armor shimmering with a dull violet light. She warned him that a blind man had no place in the architecture of war. Eirik reached into his pocket and pulled out a small iron-wrought trigger. He had spent hours designing this device to exploit the rigidity of her armor. He flicked the switch and a low hum filled the space between them. The vibration traveled through the ground, a frequency designed to shatter mana reinforcement. Sigrun's armor crackled, the violet light flickering and dying in an instant. She stumbled, her balance faltering as the heavy plates became a burden. Eirik stepped forward, his movements confident and precise. He told her that the kingdom was built on a foundation of lies. He explained that every structure had a breaking point, including her reign. Sigrun gripped her sword, but the metal felt heavy and useless in her hand. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. Eirik turned his back on her and walked toward the waiting commoners. He did not need to see her face to know she was defeated. The revolution was no longer a dream, but a calculated, physical reality. He walked into the darkness, his steps steady and unwavering. The squires followed him, their books clutched tightly in their hands. He had taught them the math, and now they would build the future. He reached the end of the alley and looked up at the stars he could not see. He knew the geometry of the constellations by heart from his years of study. The world was changing, one structural shift at a time. He felt the weight of the journal in his coat, a map of the coming war. He was the architect, and he had designed a path that even he could walk. The night deepened, the shadows stretching long and thin across the city. He found his allies waiting by the gate, their faces set in grim determination. They looked to him for the next instruction, their trust absolute. He raised his hand, pointing toward the keep of the capital. He told them that the walls would fall before the dawn. They moved as one, a silent tide of logic against the dying magic. Eirik walked in the center, his mind a blueprint of the city's collapse. He felt the vibration of the world, the pulse of the stone beneath his feet. He was blind, yet he had never seen the truth of the world more clearly. The revolution began not with a shout, but with the quiet sound of a lever. He heard the gate groan as the commoners applied the pressure he had calculated. The massive structure yielded, the iron hinges screaming in protest. He stepped through the opening, his boots clicking on the palace stone. The guards were alerted, their heavy armor clanking as they rushed to intercept. He stood still, his ears mapping the trajectory of their charging footsteps. He told his allies exactly where to strike to break the knights' formation. They moved with the precision of a machine, their strikes swift and accurate. The knights fell, their mana-reinforced armor failing under the focused assault. Eirik did not move, his focus entirely on the rhythm of the battle. He heard the clash of steel, the grunt of effort, and the finality of the fall. He knew they were winning, not by magic, but by the cold, hard logic of physics. He walked forward, his hand tracing the cold, ornate carvings of the palace wall. He had come to reclaim the foundation of the kingdom. He stopped, his hand resting on the keystone of the grand archway. He felt the stress in the stone, the exact point where it would fail. He whispered a single command, and his allies struck the mark with their hammers. The archway shattered, a cascade of stone burying the entrance to the keep. The palace guards were trapped, their path to the throne room cut off. Eirik stood amidst the dust, his breath steady and calm. He had dismantled the defense of the crown without a single drop of magic. He turned toward the inner sanctum, his path now clear and unobstructed. He was the architect of his own destiny, and the design was finally complete. The final wall stood before him, the last barrier to the heart of the power. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding surface. He knew it would fall, for every wall was made by men, and men could break. The city of Oakhaven shivered under a blanket of gray mist. Eirik Vollen sat in the cramped cellar of a derelict bakery. His eyes were clouded, the irises losing their sharp focus. He tapped his fingers against a hand-drawn map of the supply tunnels. His allies stood in the shadows, their breath hitching in the damp air. He pointed to a specific junction beneath the royal granary. He explained that the stone here was porous and brittle. A single well-placed charge of mining powder would collapse the entire western artery. The resistance leader nodded and signaled his men to move out. They vanished into the dark, their boots making no sound on the wet floor. Eirik remained behind, his hand tracing the cold indentation of his ink-stained quill. He knew the supply lines were the kingdom's true lifeline. Without grain, the knights' heavy armor became nothing more than iron coffins. Above ground, the royal guards paced the perimeter of the granary. Their armor clanked rhythmically, the sound echoing through the empty streets. They looked for signs of rebellion, but saw only the shifting fog. A small group of squires crept along the exterior wall of the warehouse. They carried heavy iron sledges, their knuckles white from the strain. One squire crouched low, pressing his ear against the cold masonry. He signaled the others to strike the base of the foundation. The iron hammers hit the stone with a dull, heavy thud. Dust billowed into the air, masking their movements from the guards above. The stone groaned, a sound like grinding teeth beneath the city streets. Deep inside the palace, the king paced the length of his throne room. He clutched a report detailing the sudden failure of 3 major grain shipments. He slammed the parchment onto his mahogany desk. He demanded to know why his knights could not stop a handful of peasants. A royal advisor bowed low, his face pale and sweating. He reported that the attackers targeted the structural foundations of the city. The king narrowed his eyes, staring at the map of Oakhaven. He traced the path of the latest sabotage with a trembling finger. He realized the pattern was too precise to be mere coincidence. The attacks targeted the load-bearing beams of every major infrastructure point. He whispered the name Eirik Vollen into the cold silence of the room. He realized the Squire was not just a tactician of war. He was a surgeon, methodically cutting the tendons of the kingdom. The king called for his most trusted captain of the guard. He ordered the immediate arrest of the man who saw the world in blueprints. He did not want the siege engines anymore. He wanted the architect who knew how to turn gravity against him. Back in the cellar, Eirik felt the vibration of the distant collapse. He leaned back against the damp wall, his vision swimming with dark spots. He knew the king had finally connected the dots. He stood up, his legs shaking from the onset of a migraine. He picked up his journal, the pages filled with the geometry of collapse. He had mapped the palace, the armory, and the king's private chambers. He had designed the end of the monarchy in ink and charcoal. He heard the heavy thud of armored boots approaching the bakery entrance. The royal guards had found his trail. He blew out the single candle, plunging the room into total darkness. He relied on the memory of the room's layout to navigate the space. He stepped toward the back exit, his hand finding the familiar latch. He slipped into the narrow alleyway just as the door was kicked open. The guards swarmed the empty room, their torches flickering against the stone walls. Eirik moved through the shadows of the city with the grace of a ghost. He knew every alley, every crumbling arch, and every hidden drain pipe. He was the architect, and the city was his final, intricate design. He looked toward the palace, seeing the flicker of torches on the high ramparts. The king was waiting, but the foundation was already cracked. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his eyes. He pressed his palms against his sockets to stop the bleeding. He knew his time was running out, but the plan was in motion. The supply lines were severed, and the city was starving. The knights stood on the walls, their armor heavy and their stomachs empty. Eirik turned a corner and disappeared into the heart of the resistance. He met his lieutenants near the base of the city's grand aqueduct. He laid out the final phase of his strategy on a flat stone. He spoke of the weight of the water and the weakness of the supports. His allies listened, their eyes wide with the promise of the coming dawn. He felt a sense of peace, despite the encroaching blindness. He had taught them the logic of the world. The king would soon learn that science was a force beyond magic. He looked up at the sky, though he saw only a blur of light. The stars were aligned, and the structural integrity of the throne was failing. He raised his hand, signaling the start of the final operation. The city would fall, not by the sword, but by the math. He walked forward, his steps steady as he led the way into the dark. The revolution was no longer a dream of men. It was a physical necessity, written in the stone of the city. He was the architect, and he had designed their liberation. The guards in the distance shouted as the aqueduct began to tremble. Eirik did not look back at the chaos behind him. He kept his focus on the path ahead, towards the heart of the palace. The king's realization had come too late to save his crown. Eirik walked into the night, his mind a blueprint of the coming collapse. The city held its breath, waiting for the final, inevitable shift. He felt the pulse of the earth beneath his boots. The logic of the world was absolute, and it was on his side. He was ready to finish the design. The heavy oak doors of the royal study groaned as they swung open. Eirik Vollen stood on the threshold, his boots coated in the dust of the lower city. The king sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, his face obscured by the flickering candlelight. Beside the throne, Lady Sigrun Greet watched with eyes like sharpened glass. She held a crystal vial, its contents swirling with a pearlescent liquid silver. The king gestured to a chair, his expression unreadable in the dim, golden light. He spoke of a position as the royal architect, a title that held the weight of the entire kingdom. Eirik looked at the obsidian desk, tracing the microscopic cracks in its surface with his architect's eye. The desk was not solid. It was a lattice of tension points designed to display absolute, unwavering power. Jarl Hauk Valdres stood in the corner, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his broadsword. He shook his head once, a subtle warning that the gold-trimmed offer was merely a gilded cage. The king pushed the vial across the desk, the glass sliding silently over the dark stone. He promised that the serum would mend the torn vessels in Eirik's eyes. He stated that the pain would vanish, and the world would return to vibrant, perfect clarity. Eirik stared at the vial, his vision blurring into a haze of gray and shadow. He remembered the faces of the commoners who looked to him for a blueprint of their freedom. He thought of the resistance, a fragile structure built on logic rather than the whims of lords. Lady Sigrun stepped forward, her heels clicking like the ticking of a countdown clock. She whispered that a genius like Eirik belonged in the halls of power, not the mud of the slums. She claimed the rebellion was a collapsing wall, doomed to bury him under its own weight. Eirik shifted his weight, his legs burning with the lingering exhaustion of his ocular strain. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the silver liquid. The king leaned forward, his eyes bright with the hunger of a man who needed a tool. He offered Eirik the resources to build anything he desired, provided he turned his mind toward the crown. The offer was a bridge back to his former life, a life where he was a master of his own design. Jarl Hauk stepped away from the wall, his armor rattling with the tension of the room. He reminded Eirik that a foundation built on betrayal would never hold the weight of a revolution. Eirik looked at the king, then at the Jarl, then back to the shimmering silver cure. The temptation was a physical pressure, a weight pressing against his ribs like a collapsing beam. He realized the cure would cost him the very thing that made him a threat to the monarchy. He would see clearly, but he would be blind to the structural rot of the kingdom. He would trade his architect's eye for a life of comfort inside a dying fortress. Eirik closed his eyes, forcing his focus to settle on the internal pressure of his own skull. He felt the familiar, jagged ache of his gift, a constant reminder of the truth behind the appearances. He reached out, not for the vial, but for the edge of the obsidian desk. His fingers gripped the cold, smooth stone until his knuckles turned white. He looked up, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot, meeting the king's expectant gaze. He refused the title, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He stated that his designs belonged to the city, not to the throne. The king's expression hardened, the shadows deepening across his regal features. Lady Sigrun drew a sharp breath, her hand dropping to the dagger at her hip. Jarl Hauk stepped between Eirik and the desk, his presence a wall of iron and resolve. The king flicked his wrist, and the candles in the room flared with a sudden, violent intensity. The air grew heavy with the static of forced mana, a pressure that made Eirik's skin crawl. Eirik turned toward the door, his movements measured and calm. He left the vial sitting on the desk, a small, glowing beacon of a life he would never lead. He walked out of the study, leaving the silence of the throne room behind him. The corridors of the palace felt narrow and suffocating, a maze designed to trap the unwary. He knew the king would not let him walk away with the secrets of the palace's structural flaws. He reached the grand staircase, his feet finding the path by the memory of the geometry. He felt the Jarl's hand on his shoulder, a steady weight grounding him in the dark. They moved toward the shadows, leaving the gilded cages of the aristocracy far behind. The rebellion was a structure in progress, and the keystone was still waiting to be set. Eirik looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn began to gray the sky. He could not see the colors, but he could feel the shift in the wind. The foundation of the old world was failing, and he was the only one who saw the cracks. He walked into the night, his mind already drafting the next phase of the collapse. The king had played his hand, but the architect was the one who controlled the load. The resistance waited in the dark, and they were ready to build a new world. Eirik stood in the center of the throne room. The obsidian floor reflected the flickering torchlight in jagged, distorted patterns. He blinked, but the world remained a smear of gray motion and shifting heat signatures. The architect's eye throbbed behind his brow, casting red veils over his field of vision. He looked at the king, who sat motionless on his dais of cold, enchanted stone. A silver vial rested on the table between them, its contents swirling like trapped smoke. The king spoke, his voice a smooth promise of restoration and absolute loyalty. He claimed that the serum would mend the broken vessels within Eirik's weary eyes. Eirik watched the king's hand, noting the way the royal fingers drummed against the stone. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the smooth surface of the desk. His fingers brushed the cold vial, and he felt a sharp electric sting of magic. The king leaned back, his eyes narrowing with the predatory anticipation of a victor. Lady Sigrun watched from the shadows, her hand resting on the pommel of her blade. She did not blink, her gaze fixed on the potential end of the rebel architect. Eirik closed his eyes, forcing his focus inward to the agony of his own skull. The heat maps of the room pulsed before him, revealing the structural weaknesses of the palace. He saw the keystone of the great vaulted ceiling, a single point of failure in the stone. He traced the hidden cracks in the foundation, lines of stress glowing like dying embers. He realized the palace was a tomb, waiting for a single, well-placed blow. He opened his eyes, the red haze sharpening into a singular, clear vision of the end. He pulled his hand back from the vial, leaving it behind on the obsidian desk. He refused the king, his voice cutting through the silence like a falling blade. The king's expression shifted from triumph to a cold, jagged mask of fury. Lady Sigrun stepped forward, her armor clanking against the silence of the throne room. Eirik turned his back on the throne, his movements deliberate and devoid of hesitation. He walked toward the great hall, his feet finding the path by the geometry of the tiles. He felt the Jarl's presence near the entrance, a silent sentinel waiting in the dark. Jarl Hauk Valdris gripped his sword hilt, his knuckles white against the dark leather. They exchanged a single, brief nod, the only signal needed for the final assault. Eirik looked up at the vaulted ceiling one last time, memorizing the web of stress. The architecture of the empire was a fragile shell, and he was the one who held the hammer. He stepped into the corridor, the torches flickering as he passed them by. The air grew heavy with the static of the palace's defensive enchantments. He felt the familiar searing pressure of the eye as it mapped the final defense lines. He whispered the instructions to the Jarl, his voice a steady hum of tactical precision. Jarl Hauk nodded, his hand tightening around the hilt of his massive broadsword. They moved toward the armory, the shadows swallowing their figures in the gloom. The kingdom stood on a knife's edge, the tension vibrating in the very stones of the wall. Eirik felt his vision dim, the edges of his sight turning to black velvet. He ignored the encroaching darkness, focusing his remaining clarity on the palace layout. Every archway, every load-bearing column, every hidden passage burned in his mind. He was the architect of this ruin, and his blueprint was finally complete. The Jarl signaled the waiting rebels, his hand raised in a sharp, decisive gesture. The silence of the night shattered as the first siege engine began to grind into place. Eirik stood at the edge of the courtyard, his eyes fixed on the central keep. He felt the last vestige of his sight slipping away into the void of the night. He saw the palace not as a monument, but as a series of calculated failures. The king's power was a lie built on the shifting sands of ancient, forgotten magic. Eirik gripped the handle of a cold iron lever, his hands raw and blistered from labor. He looked at the Jarl, his face a mask of iron resolve and fading light. The final strike was ready, the momentum of the rebellion aimed at the heart of the crown. The world blurred into a gray haze, the thermal signatures of the stone fading into shadows. He was blind, but he saw the path forward with more clarity than ever before. The Jarl gave the command, and the sound of iron striking iron filled the air. Eirik let go of the lever, his heart beating in sync with the rhythm of the siege. The palace walls groaned under the sudden violent force of the kinetic impact. He turned toward the sound, his blind eyes fixed on the collapse of his own design. The throne room began to tremble, the stone foundation yielding to the weight of logic. He felt the vibration in his boots, a deep, resonant rumble that signaled the end. The king was trapped in the rubble of his own legacy, silenced by the falling ceiling. Eirik smiled, a faint, tired expression that mirrored the peace of his sacrifice. The rebellion moved forward, their shadows crossing the threshold of the crumbling keep. He stood still, a lone figure in the chaos, his work finally finished. The kingdom would burn, and from the ashes, a new world would be measured. He felt the cold wind of the morning, a promise of a sky he would never see. The Jarl reached his side, his hand resting on Eirik's shoulder in a silent tribute. They stood together as the palace collapsed, the sound of falling stone echoing into history. The architect's eye was dark, but the blueprint of the future remained etched in his mind. He listened to the silence that followed the crash, a void filled with the hope of the commoners. The era of magic had ended, and the age of the builder had finally dawned. The iron gates of Oakhaven groaned under the rhythmic thud of the Resistance's battering ram. Eirik Vollen stood at the rear of the vanguard, his hands pressed tightly against his eyes. The palace loomed ahead, a fortress of cold steel and glowing enchanted mortar. Jarl Hauk Valdris shielded Eirik from a volley of enchanted arrows with his massive tower shield. The Jarl's armor flared with a dull golden light as it absorbed the kinetic impact of the projectiles. Eirik ignored the screams of the dying and focused his remaining senses on the architecture. He could not see the stone, but he felt the vibrations of the load-bearing columns beneath his feet. He reached out and gripped the Jarl's shoulder, his fingers trembling with the strain of his failing sight. "The western pillar is a fraud," Eirik whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the siege. He pointed a shaking finger toward the base of the palace's secondary tower. Hauk turned his head, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall for a weakness that did not exist. The Jarl saw only solid granite, reinforced by the shimmering blue haze of Lady Sigrun's magic. He did not see the microscopic fissure that Eirik's mind had mapped 1,000 times before. The rebels surged forward, their improvised ladders scraping against the polished stone of the outer curtain. A knight in silver plate leaped from the parapet, his blade wreathed in crackling violet energy. He slammed into the ladder, shattering the wood into a spray of jagged splinters. Men fell from the height, their bodies hitting the courtyard with a sickening, wet thud. Eirik heard the impact and flinched, his head throbbing with a sharp, blinding spike of pain. The architect's eye burned behind his closed lids, painting the courtyard in shades of red and black. He needed to guide the Jarl, but the chaos of the slaughter was drowning out his internal map. He signaled for the reserve unit to move, but his gesture was lost in the swirling dust and smoke. Hauk roared a command, but his voice was swallowed by the screech of a defensive spell. The palace walls shifted, the stones rearranging themselves like the teeth of a giant, hungry beast. Eirik felt his stomach churn as the structural geometry of the keep began to defy gravity. He realized the magic was compensating for the damage, sealing the cracks faster than he could identify them. He reached for the Jarl's arm, but Hauk was already engaged in a brutal duel with a royal guard. Steel rang against steel, the sound vibrating through the very foundation of the courtyard. Eirik stumbled, his balance failing him as the ground beneath his feet seemed to tilt and sway. He clutched the hilt of his dagger, but his hands were slick with cold sweat and exhaustion. He needed a point of reference, a fixed object to recalibrate his fading sense of the world. He leaned against a stone crate, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath his palms. The crate was empty, discarded during the initial breach of the outer courtyard. He focused on the rhythm of the battle, the specific cadence of the knight's heavy, rhythmic footfalls. Each step was a calculation, a weight-bearing necessity that he could predict if he remained calm. He whispered the timing to a nearby rebel, his voice sharp and demanding, despite his physical weakness. The rebel hesitated, his eyes darting toward the encroaching wall of shimmering magical light. The boy did not understand the physics of the collapse, only the terror of the impending death. He turned and fled, abandoning his post as the palace's defenses intensified their assault. Eirik watched the failure of his instructions with a hollow, sinking feeling in his chest. The rebellion was losing its cohesion, the individual parts no longer moving as a single, efficient machine. He felt the weight of his own blindness, a heavy shroud that prevented him from steering the tide. Hawk backed away from the gate, his shield dented and his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked toward Eirik, his eyes wide with the realization that the strategy was falling apart. The palace was not just a building. It was an active participant in the massacre. Lady Sigrun stood on the balcony above, her hands tracing glowing runes in the freezing air. She did not need to fight, for the architecture itself was her weapon and her shield. Eirik felt the pressure of her spellwork, a crushing weight that forced him to his knees. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as the ambient mana drained the oxygen from the courtyard. He looked up, his sightless eyes fixed on the silhouette of the woman who held the city's heart. She was the architect of his suffering, the one who turned his logic into a prison. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like leaden weights pinned to the blood-slicked stone. The Jarl reached him, grabbing his arm and pulling him back into the cover of the shadows. "We are losing the ground, Eirik," the Jarl shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Eirik shook his head, his mind racing through the variables of the collapsing structure. The palace was consuming its own mass to feed the defensive barrier, weakening its own support. He reached out and grabbed the Jarl's hand, guiding his fingers to the cold, damp stone of the wall. He tapped the surface in a specific rhythmic pattern, a code only the two of them knew. The Jarl felt the vibration, a faint pulsing hum that originated from deep within the earth. He understood the intent, his expression hardening into a mask of grim, suicidal determination. He signaled the remaining rebels, his hand raised in a final desperate invitation to carnage. The men rallied, their eyes reflecting the flickering, dying light of the palace torches. They surged toward the wall, ignoring the arrows that pierced their ranks like falling needles. Eirik stayed behind, a stationary point of logic in a world spiraling into chaotic, magical ruin. He felt the palace tremble, a deep, guttural moan that emanated from the shifting, enchanted stones. The defensive barrier flickered, the blue light stuttering like a candle in a sudden, violent gale. He had found the rhythm of the collapse, a frequency that ignored the arrogance of the knights. He whispered the final instruction, his voice a steady, rhythmic pulse in the deafening roar of war. The Jarl slammed his sword into the wall at the exact point Eirik had identified. The stone groaned, a sound of tectonic shifting that silenced the screams of the dying. The palace wall began to buckle, the magic of the nobility unable to hold the weight of physics. Eirik closed his eyes, the image of the collapse burning into his mind with absolute, terrifying clarity. The rebellion was a wave, and he was the one who had finally opened the floodgates. Eirik stepped into the throne room, his boots crunching on shards of stained glass. The vast chamber stretched before him, a cathedral of cold marble and gilded iron. Lady Sigrun Greet stood upon the dais, her fingers woven into a complex glowing web. The air around her rippled like water under a summer sun. She moved her hands, and the floor tilted at an impossible, sickening angle. Eirik grabbed a heavy stone pillar, his knuckles turning white as gravity shifted. The throne room groaned, the very architecture bending to her whims. Marble columns twisted like wet clay, their ornate capitals scraping against the vaulted ceiling. Sigrun watched him with a sharp, predatory smile. She flicked her wrist, and the path beneath Eirik's feet spiraled into a vertical drop. He slid backward, his fingers clawing at the polished floor for purchase. His architect's eye throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain behind his eyelids. The room shimmered with thermal signatures, showing the instability of the enchanted masonry. He saw the stress fractures in the walls, glowing a dangerous, brilliant red. Sigrun laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally against the warping stone. She believed she controlled the geometry of the entire fortress. Eirik watched the way her fingers traced the ley lines in the air. Every spell she cast required a precise, melodic hum of magical resonance. He noticed the slight tremor in her left hand as she maintained the distortion. He realized the room's stability relied entirely on the consistency of her focus. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a small, heavy iron tuning fork. He struck the metal against the stone floor, the sound ringing out sharp and clear. The vibrations traveled through the floor, buzzing against the soles of his boots. Sigrun's brow furrowed, her concentration momentarily snagged by the piercing metallic note. The floor beneath her feet shuddered, the marble cracking under the sudden discordant resonance. Eirik struck the floor again, harder this time, aiming for the room's acoustic sweet spot. The sound waves collided with the flowing mana, tearing through her intricate web of light. Sigrun stumbled, her hands dropping as the room lurched back toward a natural state. A heavy chandelier overhead swayed, its iron chains grinding against the stone anchor. She hissed, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as the architecture fought her command. Eirik did not hesitate, pushing himself off the pillar toward the dais. He ignored the blinding flash of his own ocular hemorrhaging as he pushed his eye. The heat map of the room exploded into a blinding white-hot geometry of failure. He saw the central keystone of the dais, the point where all magical force converged. It was a small, unassuming slab of granite, pulsing with a faint, violet light. He drew his dagger, the steel vibrating in rhythm with the echoes of his tuning fork. Sigrun raised a hand, a bolt of kinetic energy gathering in her palm. Eirik ducked, the air whistling as the spell shattered a statue behind his head. He lunged forward, slamming his palm against the keystone with precise, calculated force. The stone groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through the marrow of his bones. Sigrun shrieked, her hands grasping at the air as the spell collapsed. The throne room buckled, the walls bowing outward as the magic lost its hold. Dust rained down from the ceiling, thick and gray, choking the air in the chamber. Eirik fell to his knees, his vision fading into a dark, swirling fog. The floor leveled out, the unnatural tilt finally surrendering to the laws of gravity. Sigrun collapsed against the throne, her face pale and her breath coming in ragged gasps. The glowing runes on her fingertips flickered and died, leaving only charred skin behind. She looked at her hands, then up at the ceiling as a massive crack split the dome. Eirik watched her through a haze of blood, his sight failing him rapidly. The palace was losing its integrity, the structure finally bowing to the weight of its own greed. He had broken the geometry of her faith with the cold logic of a single strike. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the settling of shifting stone. Eirik stood up, his legs shaking as he faced the woman who had orchestrated his ruin. She looked small now, stripped of the grand architecture that had once been her shield. He held his dagger steady, the metal cold and indifferent in his sweating palm. The final confrontation had reached its end, measured not in power but in physics. The throne room floor heaved, a jagged wave of marble cresting toward the dais. Eirik scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the slick, pulverized stone. Dust clouds choked the air, swirling in the dim light of the dying lanterns. The massive gilded throne tilted, its foundation groaning with the weight of centuries. He saw the dark, viscous liquid seeping from the base of the dais. It was blood magic, binding the mortar to the very souls of the ancestors. The king stood frozen, his eyes wide as the ceiling beams began to moan. A massive support pillar cracked, spiderweb fractures racing up its ornate length. Eirik watched the thermal signatures flare, the structure screaming under the sudden imbalance. He gripped his dagger, the steel vibrating in sympathetic rhythm with the failing masonry. The king shouted a command, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of grinding stone. Sigrun's former web of power dissolved, leaving the architecture to fight its own gravity. A heavy tapestry caught fire, the flames licking at the gold-leafed rafters above. Eirik saw the main load-bearing arch, the keystone shivering under the immense shifting pressure. He lunged for the dais, his legs burning with the effort of the long, brutal fight. The floor beneath him dropped 6 inches, the shock jolting through his weary frame. He reached the base of the throne and jammed his blade into the central fissure. The stone resisted, cold and unyielding, until he pried it with a desperate final heave. A sickening snap echoed through the chamber, the sound of iron pins shearing under tension. The dais split open, revealing a hollow core filled with pulsating crimson runes. The king tumbled sideways, his royal robe snagging on a jagged piece of splintered marble. He scrambled toward the exit, but the floor pulled away like a receding tide. Eirik watched the king's desperate reach, his fingers clawing at the shifting, unstable tiles. The entire palace groaned, a tectonic shift that threatened to pull the world down. The walls bowed outward, the mortar turning to dust as the blood magic seal broke. Ceiling stones rained down, crushing the gilded chairs and the remnants of the court. Eirik felt the floor vanish beneath him, the air rushing past his ears in a roar. He grabbed a hanging iron chain, his shoulders screaming in protest as his weight caught. Below him, the throne room floor collapsed into the dark, forgotten vaults of the keep. The king disappeared into the gray abyss, his shout cut short by the falling debris. Eirik swung through the smoke, his vision blurring as his eye flickered and dimmed. He saw the crown tumbling through the air, a useless circle of gold in the chaos. The monarchy's seat of power shattered, its geometry reduced to a pile of broken rock. Dust filled the chamber, thick and suffocating, masking the carnage of the fallen order. He landed on a ledge of solid granite, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The palace continued to shift, the upper floors sliding downward with a thunderous, rhythmic thud. Every collapse followed the laws of physics, the structure finally settling into its own ruin. He looked down into the dark, where the king had been only a moment before. The ruling order lay buried beneath tons of masonry, silenced by the logic of gravity. Eirik wiped the blood from his eyes, his hands shaking with a strange, hollow relief. The magic was gone, burned away by the friction of a collapsing, man-made machine. He stood up slowly, his body aching from the strain of the long, final siege. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the horizon, illuminating the dust-choked ruins. The city remained silent, the people watching the smoke rise from the broken heart of power. He walked toward the jagged hole where the main gate had once stood tall. The weight of the crown was gone, replaced by the weight of 1,000 new lives. He stepped into the cool morning air, his boots crunching on the gravel of history. The palace was a skeleton of its former self, a monument to the end of magic. He breathed in the scent of wet stone and ash, the smell of a new beginning. His eye finally went dark, the heat maps fading into the steady gray light of reality. He was no longer a squire or a weapon, but a man standing in the wreckage. He looked toward the horizon, the path ahead clear, simple, and entirely built by hand. The morning sun crested the jagged horizon of Oakhaven. It illuminated a landscape of pulverized stone and twisted iron. Eirik Vollen stood amidst the debris of the royal keep. His boots crunched on fragments of marble that once formed the throne. The city walls lay shattered like discarded toy blocks. Thick plumes of gray smoke drifted toward the cloudless sky. Below the ruins, the commoners emerged from their cramped cellar dwellings. They moved with the hesitant gait of people unlearning a life of fear. The heavy, suffocating weight of magical influence finally dissipated. Eirik wiped a smudge of soot from his scarred knuckles. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the palace towers once loomed. He felt the absence of the architect's eye as a cold, hollow silence. There was no heat map overlay to highlight the structural instability of the rubble. He relied now on the calloused sensitivity of his own fingertips. A young girl stepped over a fallen beam, her eyes wide with bewilderment. She looked at Eirik, then back at the skeleton of the city. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a roll of parchment. The paper was stained with ink and damp from the night's mist. He unrolled the map against the flat surface of a broken pedestal. It displayed a grid of streets designed for drainage and structural resilience. The girl leaned in, tracing the lines with a small, dirty finger. Eirik pointed to a cluster of buildings marked for communal living. He explained that these homes would stand without the need for mana reinforcement. The girl nodded, not fully comprehending the physics but trusting the geometry. Jarl Hauk Valdris approached from the southern gate, his armor dented and dull. The commander's sword remained sheathed at his side, its pommel chipped. He stopped beside Eirik and surveyed the chaos of the marketplace. The knights who once guarded the walls now stood idle and confused. Their armor felt heavy without the familiar hum of kinetic reinforcement. Hawk looked at the blueprint, his brow furrowing at the precise measurements. He asked how a city could endure without the protection of the old arts. Eirik tapped the center of the parchment with a steady hand. He told the Jarl that stability was born of weight and balance, not blood. Hawk stared at the ruins of the palace for a long, quiet moment. He finally acknowledged that the old ways had only ever built a cage. A group of masons gathered near the base of the central square. They held rusted tools, waiting for direction from the man who broke the world. Eirik walked toward them, the parchment clutched firmly in his grip. He pointed to a foundation of granite that remained stubbornly intact. He instructed them to clear the rubble in a precise, circular pattern. The men moved with a newfound purpose, clearing stones by hand. They worked in rhythmic silence, the sound of metal against rock echoing. Eirik watched the progress, his mind calculating the load-bearing capacity of the soil. He saw the city not as a graveyard, but as an unfinished schematic. Lady Sigrun Greet's former agents watched from the shadows of a side alley. They held their breath, their hands hovering near their empty, magicless belts. Eirik ignored them, focusing instead on the placement of a new water conduit. The knowledge he had brought from another life dictated the flow of the future. He sketched a cross-section of an arch on a flat stone with a piece of charcoal. He showed the masons how to distribute the weight of the roof tiles. They watched, amazed, as the simple sketch revealed a hidden strength. The air smelled of fresh dust and the damp earth of a cooling world. By midday, the center of the square had been cleared to bare bedrock. Eirik sat on a crate, his vision blurred by the lingering strain of his past labors. He took a piece of dried meat from his pouch and chewed it slowly. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of the long siege. A group of children began to stack stones according to his earlier instructions. They built a small, stable wall, testing the physics of the mortar. Eirik smiled, a fleeting expression that rarely reached his weary, sunken eyes. He watched them learn the laws of the world that had nothing to do with magic. Hauk returned with a canteen of water and placed it on the crate. He asked if the people would truly accept a life without the old miracles. Eirik looked at the children, their faces bright with the challenge of the build. He replied that freedom was a heavy burden, but one worth the carrying. The sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the broken city. Eirik opened his journal, the pages filled with equations and structural diagrams. He began to draft the elevation for a bridge across the central canal. He calculated the tension required to span the gap without using iron supports. His pen moved across the paper with the precision of a master builder. He accounted for wind velocity and the shifting weight of the seasonal tides. The surrounding ruins seemed to shrink as the new designs took shape. He saw the city rising from the ash, a monument to human ingenuity. The night arrived, cool and clear, devoid of the shimmering aura of mana. Eirik lit a small lantern, its flame steady and true in the quiet air. He worked through the darkness, refining the blueprints for the city's defense. He did not plan for walls of magic, but for systems of leverage and drain. The future of Oakhaven rested on the integrity of these simple, ink-drawn lines. He knew the transition would be long and fraught with the bitterness of the old guard. But the foundation was set, and the laws of physics remained on his side. He closed the journal, the weight of the work settling into his bones. He stood up, his joints aching, and looked out over the dark, sprawling ruins. The city slept, unaware of the transformation that had already begun. Eirik turned toward his small, makeshift shelter in the shadow of the square. He looked back at the blueprints one last time under the flickering light. He saw the kingdom not as it had been, but as it would be built. He extinguished the lantern, leaving the world to the quiet gravity of the night. The sun rose over Oakhaven, hitting the jagged edges of half-rebuilt stone walls. Eirik Vollen stood on a wooden scaffolding, his fingers tracing a blueprint of the new harbor. His eyes were clouded, the constant strain of the architect's eye leaving his vision a haze of gray shapes. Below him, a group of former palace knights stood with their hands on their belt buckles, their expressions sour. They wore their rusted armor like a badge of fading authority, refusing to shed the weight of their magical past. One knight stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the loose mortar and gravel. He demanded that the masonry work stop, claiming the city walls required the blessing of the old blood magic. Eirik turned his head toward the voice, his movements slow and deliberate. He told the knight that stone held its own strength without the need for ancient, corrupting rituals. The knight spat on the ground, his hand tightening around the hilt of a blade that no longer hummed with mana. He warned that the commoners were lost without the protection of the knightly order. Eirik pointed to the bridge the children had built, its arches standing firm against the morning tide. He explained that physics provided a more reliable shield than any fading enchantment. The knight's face flushed with a dark, simmering rage. He drew his sword, the metal scraping harshly against the stone floor of the scaffold. Eirik did not reach for a weapon, his hands remaining empty and open at his sides. He watched the knight's stance, noting the uneven weight distribution that signaled a lack of true discipline. The knight lunged, his strike clumsy and fueled by a desperate, misplaced pride. Eirik stepped to the side, letting the momentum of the swing carry the attacker past him. The knight stumbled, his heel catching on a protruding beam of oak. He fell forward, his armor clattering like a broken clock against the hard, unforgiving granite. A small crowd of laborers gathered, their faces hardened by months of honest, back-breaking work. They watched the fallen knight with a cold, detached silence that spoke of a new era. The knight struggled to stand, his breath ragged, and his eyes darting toward his fellow soldiers. He saw no movement in their ranks, only the same weary, hollow stares of men who had seen the future. Eirik walked to the edge of the scaffold, his cane tapping rhythmically against the wooden planks. He told the knight that the age of the iron wrought was finished, replaced by the permanence of geometry. The knight rose to his feet, his jaw set in a line of grim, final defiance. He sheathed his sword with a sharp metallic click that echoed across the quiet square. He turned and walked away, his heavy armor dragging against the dust of the city. Eirik watched him go, the blurry outline of the man fading into the shadows of the alley. He returned to his blueprints, his hands beginning to tremble as the weight of the day settled into his joints. He picked up a piece of charcoal and sketched a support column, his lines steady despite the exhaustion. The city around him was changing, the smell of fresh timber replacing the ozone scent of magic. He felt a sharp, sudden coldness in his chest, a sensation that had nothing to do with the morning air. He looked down at his tunic, seeing a dark, spreading stain blooming across the fabric. Behind him, a shadow detached itself from the wall, the glint of a hidden dagger catching the light. It was an assassin, his face obscured by a hood, his movements silent and predatory. Eirik fell to his knees, his breath hitching in a series of sharp, shallow gasps. The assassin stepped closer, his boots pressing into the dust where the blueprint had fallen. He whispered that the old guard would never allow a builder to dismantle their world. Eirik reached out, his hand brushing against the rough surface of a stone column. He felt the structural integrity of the scaffold, the way the weight was balanced on a single central pin. He realized the assassin was standing directly over the primary stress point of the platform. With a final desperate effort, Eirik gripped the pin and pulled it free from the wood. The platform shivered, the timber groaning under the sudden shift in load-bearing pressure. The assassin's eyes widened as the floor tilted sharply toward the abyss of the harbor. He tumbled backward, his balance destroyed by the laws of physics Eirik had taught him to respect. He fell into the darkness below, his scream cut short by the sound of crashing debris. Eirik collapsed against the wall, the world spinning into a soft, dark blur. He looked up at the sky, seeing the clouds form patterns that resembled the complex grids of his mind. He knew his work was not finished, but the foundation was laid in stone and logic. He closed his eyes, the sound of the city's hammers ringing out like a steady, rhythmic heart. The struggle to survive without magic was only beginning, but the people now held the tools to build their own path. Eirik's head slumped against the cold granite, his final breath escaping in a quiet, satisfied sigh. The blueprints lay scattered around him, the ink lines clear and permanent under the rising sun. A young girl climbed the scaffolding, her eyes wide as she saw the master builder resting in the dust. She picked up his journal, her small fingers tracing the complex diagrams of the bridge. She looked out over the city, seeing not the ruins of the past, but the potential of the future. In the distance, a sail appeared on the horizon, a ship from across the sea with a strange, foreign flag. The sailors on the deck pointed toward Oakhaven, their hands holding instruments that looked like brass compasses. They were not using magic, but their own cold, calculated brand of science. The girl looked back at Eirik, then toward the incoming ship, her expression hardening with curiosity. The age of the architect had ended, but the era of the builder had just begun. Eirik Vollen lay still upon the cold, uneven stone of the workshop floor. His lungs rattled with the final, shallow intake of a life spent calculating the impossible. Blood pooled beneath his tunic, dark and viscous against the gray dust of Oakhaven. The silence of the room felt heavy, pressing against the scattered vellum pages of his life's work. Outside, the city bells tolled for the end of a reign, their iron voices ringing hollow in the thin air. His hand rested near a brass compass, its needle trembling as if searching for a north that no longer existed. The young girl who had found him knelt by his side, her eyes fixed on the ink-stained blueprints. She did not weep, for the weight of the moment had turned her grief into a sharp, quiet resolve. She gathered the journals, tucking the heavy leather bindings against her chest. The ink lines on the parchment depicted a world stripped of magic, held together by the cold, precise laws of physics. Years passed like the steady turning of a water wheel. The city of Oakhaven transformed, its jagged spires replaced by the clean, sweeping curves of arches and load-bearing trusses. Steam rose from new industrial foundries, replacing the flickering, sickly glow of mana-infused hearths. A young boy sat on a sun-drenched wall, his fingers tracing the faded diagrams in Eirik's original journal. He looked at a crumbling stone archway, his gaze narrowing as if he could see the invisible threads of stress running through the masonry. The world around him moved with the clockwork rhythm of science, a testament to the man who had died in the mud. But the horizon was shifting. A black-sailed vessel cut through the morning mist, its hull sleek and devoid of any traditional heraldry. Men stood upon the deck, their hands resting on brass instruments that hummed with a low, vibrating hum. They did not cast spells, yet the sea parted before their prow as if commanded by the very geometry of the water. The boy on the wall stood up, his hand tightening around the journal as he felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. You stare at the screen, watching a world that thinks it has finally mastered its own foundations. You believe that knowledge is a shield, that logic is a wall that no storm can ever breach. But look closer at the horizon, where the cold, unfeeling machines are already turning toward you. The cycle you've been watching hasn't ended, it has simply changed its shape.